What if everything you think you know about thinking is wrong? Picture this. You're absolutely certain the ship floating before you is the same one that sailed these waters for centuries, but every single piece of wood has been replaced. You're convinced you'd never step into a machine that could give you perfect happiness, but when pressed, you can't explain why. You're sure you can tell truth from lies, but a simple question about honesty leaves you speechless. Welcome to the twilight zone of human reasoning, where our most basic assumptions crumble under examination, where simple questions reveal impossible contradictions, and where the very foundations of knowledge turn to quicksand beneath our feet. These aren't just abstract puzzles dreamed up by philosophers with too much time on their hands. They're windows into the fundamental architecture of human thought, revealing why our brains, those 3-pound universes that can split atoms and compose symphonies, sometimes tie themselves into logical knots that would make a sailor weep. From ancient Greeks, who discovered that a single sentence could shatter the concept of truth itself, to modern thinkers who found that the harder we try to justify our beliefs, the further we drift from solid ground. These paradoxes don't just challenge what we think, they challenge how we think. So buckle up. We're about to take a journey through the most mind-bending logical puzzles ever conceived. Fair warning, you may never look at reality the same way again. The Ship of Theseus. Picture, if you will, a magnificent wooden ship floating in an ancient harbor. Its sails billow with Mediterranean winds, and its hull bears the scars of countless voyages. This vessel has been at sea for decades, perhaps centuries, carrying heroes and merchants across treacherous waters. But time, that relentless sculptor, has begun its work. One day, a single plank begins to rot. The ship's carpenter, skilled in his craft, carefully removes the damaged wood and replaces it with a fresh piece of oak. The ship continues its journeys, looking identical to how it appeared the day before. But something profound has occurred. A question has been born that will puzzle thinkers for millennia. Months pass, and another plank requires replacement. Then another. The process continues gradually, imperceptibly, like the changing of seasons or the aging of a face. Each replacement seems insignificant, yet collectively they tell a different story. After 7 years, some say 10, others claim 20. Every single original piece of wood has been replaced. Now comes the heart-stopping question that transforms this simple maintenance story into a philosophical earthquake. Is this still the same ship? Your intuition might immediately respond, of course it is. It looks the same, functions the same, and has maintained its identity throughout the gradual process. This perspective emphasizes continuity and function over material composition. After all, the ship never ceased to exist, never stopped being useful, never lost its essential character as a vessel for crossing water. But pause for a moment and consider the alternative view. If every single molecule of the original ship has been replaced, how can we honestly claim it's the same object? None of the wood that first felt the Mediterranean spray remains. Not a single nail that was forged in the original shipyard still holds the vessel together. From this perspective, we're looking at an entirely different ship that merely happens to occupy the same conceptual space as its predecessor. The paradox deepens when we introduce a thought experiment that pushes our intuitions to their breaking point. Imagine that the ship's carpenter, being a methodical and frugal person, carefully stored each removed plank in a warehouse. After the transformation was complete, this carpenter, let's call him Daedalus, decides to rebuild a ship using only the original materials. Now we have 2 ships. One continues to sail the seas, bearing the name and reputation of the original, but constructed entirely of new materials. The other sits in a harbor, built from every single piece of the original ship, but assembled for the first time in years. Which one deserves to be called the true Ship of Theseus? This scenario forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our common sense notion of identity might be more fragile than we ever imagined. The ship that continues the original's voyages has maintained functional and temporal continuity. It never stopped being a ship, never ceased its purpose. Yet the reconstructed vessel has material continuity. It's composed of the actual substances that once sailed ancient seas. The implications stretch far beyond maritime philosophy. Consider your own body, this remarkable vessel that carries your consciousness through life. Science tells us that virtually every cell in your body replaces itself over the course of 7 to 10 years. The neurons firing as you process these words are not the same neurons that fired when you first learned to read. Your skin, your muscles, even the calcium in your bones, all have been replaced multiple times throughout your life. If we apply the Ship of Theseus paradox to human identity, we must ask, are you the same person you were a decade ago? Your memories connect present to past, creating a narrative thread that seems to maintain continuity. But if every physical component of your being has been replaced, what exactly persists? Is identity merely a story we tell ourselves? A convenient fiction that helps us navigate the world? The paradox becomes even more unsettling when we consider modern medical interventions. Imagine someone who gradually replaces parts of their body with artificial components. They begin with a prosthetic leg, then an arm, then synthetic organs. If medical technology advanced sufficiently, they might replace their heart, their liver, eventually even portions of their brain. At what point, if any, do they cease to be human? At what point do they cease to be themselves? Different philosophical traditions have grappled with this question in fascinating ways. Some argue for what we might call the material view. That identity is fundamentally tied to physical substance. From this perspective, the Ship of Theseus becomes a different ship once its materials are replaced, just as you become a different person as your cells regenerate. Others embrace the functional view, suggesting that identity lies not in materials, but in patterns, relationships, and purposes. A ship remains a ship as long as it functions as a vessel for transportation across water. A person remains the same person as long as their consciousness, memories, and psychological patterns maintain continuity. Still others propose the narrative view, arguing that identity is essentially a story, a coherent account that connects past, present, and future into meaningful unity. From this perspective, the Ship of Theseus remains the same ship as long as its story continues uninterrupted, regardless of material changes. The ancient Greeks who first pondered this paradox couldn't have imagined how relevant it would become in our digital age. Today, we face questions about artificial intelligence and consciousness that echo the Ship of Theseus in surprising ways. If we create a computer program that learns and adapts, gradually modifying its code until none of the original programming remains, is it the same program? If we could upload human consciousness to a computer, would that digital entity be the same person as the biological original? These questions aren't merely academic exercises. They have profound practical implications. Legal systems must grapple with questions of corporate identity when companies merge, split, and transform. Medical ethics must address what constitutes the same person when treating patients with severe memory loss or dramatic personality changes. Philosophy of mind must wrestle with the nature of consciousness itself. The Ship of Theseus teaches us that identity might not be the solid, unchanging foundation we imagine it to be. Instead, it might be more like a river, constantly flowing, constantly changing, yet maintaining recognizable patterns and boundaries. The water that flows past any given point is never the same water, yet we still call it the same river. Perhaps the deepest insight of the Ship of Theseus paradox is that it reveals the poverty of binary thinking. We want clean answers. Either the ship is the same or it's different. But reality might be more nuanced, more fluid than our conceptual frameworks can easily capture. The ship might be both the same and different, depending on what aspects of identity we choose to emphasize. This paradox invites us to embrace a more sophisticated understanding of identity, one that recognizes multiple valid perspectives and resists the temptation to oversimplify complex phenomena. In doing so, it prepares our minds for even more challenging puzzles that await us on this philosophical journey. As we move forward, carry with you this question: what makes you, you? Is it your memories, your body, your consciousness, your relationships, or something else entirely? The answer might be more mysterious than you ever imagined. The experience machine. Imagine walking through a sterile laboratory corridor. your footsteps echoing against polished walls. At the end of this hallway stands a door marked with a simple sign: Perfect Life Inside. Behind that door waits a machine that represents either humanity's greatest achievement or its most seductive trap. This device, conceived by philosopher Robert Nozick, can do something that sounds like pure science fiction, but feels surprisingly plausible. It can create any experience you desire with perfect fidelity. Step inside, and the machine will stimulate your brain in such a way that you'll experience a life of unimaginable fulfillment. You could be a world-renowned artist whose paintings hang in the Louvre, an explorer discovering new galaxies among the stars, or a teacher whose wisdom transforms generations of students. The experience would feel completely real, because to your consciousness, it would be real. Your brain wouldn't know the difference between genuine accomplishment and manufactured experience. You'd feel the satisfaction of genuine achievement, the warmth of authentic love, the pride of meaningful work. The machine could eliminate all suffering while maximizing every form of joy and fulfillment you could imagine. Here's the crucial detail. Once you enter the machine, you would have no awareness that your experiences are artificial. To your consciousness, every moment would feel as authentic as any experience you've ever had. You wouldn't spend your time wondering whether your achievements are real, because from your perspective, they absolutely would be. The philosopher poses a simple question: would you plug in? Your initial reaction might be immediate and decisive. Of course, who wouldn't want a perfect life? But as you consider the implications more deeply, something interesting happens. Most people find themselves hesitating, even though they can't immediately articulate why. Let's explore what makes this choice so difficult. The machine offers everything we typically associate with a good life: happiness, achievement, meaningful relationships, creative fulfillment, and freedom from suffering. If these things are what we truly value, the decision should be obvious. Yet something about the scenario feels deeply wrong. One source of discomfort might be our attachment to authenticity. When you climb a mountain, part of the satisfaction comes from knowing that you actually climbed it, that your muscles ached, that you persevered through difficult moments, that you stood on an actual summit with real wind in your face. The machine could make you feel all of these sensations, but it couldn't make them genuine in the way we typically understand authenticity. Consider the difference between receiving a heartfelt compliment from a friend and having someone lie to make you feel good. Even if both create the same immediate sensation of validation, we value the authentic compliment more highly. Why? Because we care not just about how experiences feel, but about their actual relationship to reality. The machine also raises troubling questions about agency and self-determination. In the artificial world, you would feel like you're making choices and shaping your destiny, but these would be illusions. The machine would be controlling every aspect of your experience, making you feel powerful while rendering you completely powerless. Would a life without genuine agency be worth living, even if it felt fulfilling from the inside? There's also the matter of connection and relationships. The people you'd interact with in the machine would be simulations. Sophisticated ones perhaps, but not real human beings with their own consciousness, needs, and autonomy. You might feel loved and appreciated, but you wouldn't actually be contributing to anyone else's life or forming genuine bonds with other conscious beings. The relationships that seem to give life much of its meaning would be replaced by elaborate fantasies. But let's challenge these intuitions. Why should authenticity matter if the experiences feel identical? If the machine can provide all the psychological benefits of genuine achievement without the risk of failure or the possibility of suffering, isn't that strictly better? After all, many of our authentic experiences are already heavily mediated by technology, social conditioning, and biological processes we don't fully understand or control. Consider how much of your current life depends on systems and structures you didn't create and don't fully comprehend. The food you eat, the entertainment you consume, the information you receive, all are shaped by forces beyond your direct control. In what sense is your current life more authentic than what the machine could provide? Furthermore, the machine could potentially offer experiences that are impossible in the real world. You could understand complex mathematical theorems intuitively, experience synesthesia that lets you see music and hear colors, or feel the deep satisfaction of solving humanity's greatest challenges. These experiences might expand consciousness in ways that physical reality never could. The choice becomes even more complex when we consider the perspectives of different philosophical traditions. Utilitarians, who judge actions by their consequences and focus on maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, might argue that the machine is obviously the right choice. If it produces more happiness and less suffering than real life, how could we justify rejecting it? Existentialists, on the other hand, might argue that the machine represents a fundamental betrayal of human nature. They would contend that meaning comes not from experiencing happiness, but from confronting authentic challenges, making genuine choices, and creating meaning through our actions in the real world. From this perspective, the machine offers a comfortable prison rather than genuine fulfillment. Religious and spiritual traditions might add another dimension, suggesting that the machine severs our connection to the divine, to ultimate reality, or to the spiritual growth that comes through facing genuine challenges. Many traditions emphasize that suffering and struggle, while difficult, serve important purposes in human development that the machine would eliminate. The experience machine paradox also illuminates our relationship with technology in the modern world. While we don't have machines that can create perfect virtual realities, we do have increasingly sophisticated forms of digital entertainment, social media, and virtual experiences. These technologies offer us curated, optimized versions of reality that can be more engaging and immediately satisfying than everyday life. Consider how people can become absorbed in video games, social media platforms, or streaming services for hours at a time. These experiences often provide immediate rewards, social connection, and escapism in ways that everyday life might not. Are we already moving toward our own versions of the experience machine? And if so, what does that tell us about what we truly value? Some argue that the machine scenario is unrealistic because it assumes we can separate consciousness from the body and the physical world. They contend that embodied experience, the fact that we exist as physical beings in a material universe, is fundamental to what makes us human. The machine might be able to stimulate our brains, but it couldn't replicate the complex interactions between consciousness and physical reality that shape who we are. Others point out that the machine thought experiment reveals biases in our thinking. Perhaps our resistance to the machine comes not from rational evaluation, but from evolutionary programming that makes us suspicious of anything that seems too good to be true. Our ancestors who were cautious about easy rewards were more likely to survive than those who weren't. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of personal growth and character development. Much of what we consider meaningful personal development comes through facing challenges, overcoming obstacles, and learning from failures. The machine could make you feel like you've grown and developed. But would this artificial growth have the same value as genuine character development earned through real experience? Think about someone you admire for their wisdom, compassion, or resilience. These qualities typically develop through years of facing genuine difficulties, making mistakes, and gradually learning to respond more skillfully to life's challenges. Could the machine produce the same depth of character without the authentic struggles that typically forge it? Yet we might ask whether the process matters if the outcome is the same. If the machine could give you the psychological characteristics of a wise, compassionate person, would it matter that you didn't earn these qualities through traditional means? This question becomes particularly relevant as we develop technologies that might be able to enhance human capabilities directly through pharmaceutical, genetic, or neural interventions. The experience machine ultimately forces us to examine what we value most fundamentally about existence. Is life primarily about maximizing positive experiences and minimizing negative ones? Is it about forming genuine connections with other conscious beings? Is it about creating authentic meaning through our choices and actions? Is it about growing and developing as individuals? Or is it about something else entirely? Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the experience machine paradox is that it doesn't have a clearly correct answer. Both choices, entering the machine or remaining in reality, involve significant trade-offs. The machine offers guaranteed happiness, but eliminates authenticity. Reality offers authenticity, but guarantees suffering. neither option is perfect, and reasonable people can disagree about which is preferable. This ambiguity might itself be the paradox's most important insight. It suggests that human values are complex, sometimes contradictory, and not easily reduced to simple formulas. We want happiness, but we also want authenticity. We want to avoid suffering, but we also want our achievements to mean something. We want security, but we also want freedom. The experience machine teaches us that the question, what makes life worth living, doesn't have a simple answer. It requires us to grapple with deep questions about consciousness, meaning, authenticity, and value that each person must answer for themselves. As we continue our philosophical journey, carry this question with you. What aspects of your life do you value so highly that you wouldn't trade them even for guaranteed happiness? Your answer might reveal something profound about what it means to be human. The Munchausen trilemma. Picture yourself as an ancient architect tasked with building the greatest structure ever conceived. Not a temple or palace, but something far more ambitious. A foundation for all human knowledge. You approach this task with confidence, knowing that every great building requires a solid base. But as you begin to dig, you discover something that will haunt philosophers for centuries. There is no bottom. This is the essence of the Munchausen trilemma, a philosophical puzzle that reveals the profound difficulty, perhaps impossibility, of justifying any belief with absolute certainty. Named after the legendary Baron Munchausen, who claimed to have pulled himself out of a swamp by his own hair, this trilemma exposes the absurdity of trying to lift human knowledge by its own bootstraps. The problem begins with a seemingly innocent question. How do you know what you know? On the surface, this appears straightforward. You know something because you have good reasons for believing it. But what makes those reasons good? You need other reasons to justify your reasons. And what justifies those reasons? The need for justification never ends, creating a logical puzzle with no satisfactory solution. The trilemma presents three possible outcomes for any attempt to justify a belief, each leading to an unsatisfactory conclusion. These three possibilities: circular reasoning, infinite regress, and arbitrary assumptions, represent the only logical options available, yet none provides the solid foundation we seek for knowledge. Let's explore each horn of this trilemma through concrete examples that illuminate the profound challenges they present. Circular reasoning occurs when we justify a belief by referring to other beliefs that ultimately depend on the original belief for their own justification. Imagine someone claiming, "I know the Bible is true because God wrote it, and I know God wrote it because the Bible says so." This argument moves in a circle, with each claim supporting the other, but neither having independent justification. Circular reasoning might seem obviously flawed, but it's more pervasive than we might initially recognize. Consider how we justify our belief in logical reasoning itself. We use logic to demonstrate that logic is reliable, but this approach assumes the very thing we're trying to prove. We trust our senses to tell us that our senses are generally trustworthy, but this validation is itself circular. Even science, our most rigorous method for understanding the world, contains elements of circularity. We use scientific methods to validate scientific methods, employ reason to demonstrate the reliability of reason, and use empirical observation to justify our trust in empirical observation. These foundations, while practically useful, cannot escape the logical circle when subjected to rigorous philosophical scrutiny. The second horn of the trilemma is infinite regress. The possibility that every justification requires another justification, creating an endless chain of reasoning. Imagine a curious child who responds to every explanation with, "Why?" You explain that the sky appears blue because of how light scatters in the atmosphere. Why does light scatter? Because of the interaction between photons and molecules. Why do photons interact with molecules? Because of electromagnetic forces. Why do electromagnetic forces work that way? The questions could continue forever. This infinite regress reveals something troubling about the nature of explanation. Every answer seems to generate new questions, and no answer appears to be truly final. If we demand justification for every belief, we embark on a journey that has no end. The chain of reasoning stretches infinitely backward, never reaching a secure foundation. The scientific quest for understanding exemplifies this challenge. Each discovery seems to raise more questions than it answers. When we discover how stars form, we want to know why the physical laws that govern star formation exist. When we understand those laws, we seek explanations for the fundamental constants that make those laws possible. The pursuit of knowledge appears to be an endless regression with no ultimate terminus. The third option, arbitrary assumptions, involves accepting certain beliefs without justification, essentially stopping the chain of reasoning by declaring that some things simply don't require further explanation. This approach avoids both circularity and infinite regress, but at the cost of rationality itself. If we can arbitrarily choose to stop demanding justification, why stop at any particular point? What makes one assumption more acceptable than another? Consider mathematical axioms, such as the assumption that identical things are equal to themselves. This seems obviously true, but it cannot be proven without using logic that itself depends on this very assumption. Mathematics, despite its reputation for certainty, rests on axioms that we simply choose to accept without further justification. Religious faith often involves arbitrary assumptions as well. Believers might accept certain truths about divine nature or sacred texts without demanding further justification. While this approach can provide psychological comfort and practical guidance, it doesn't satisfy those who insist on rational justification for all beliefs. The Munchausen trilemma reveals that these three options, circular reasoning, infinite regress, and arbitrary assumptions, are exhaustive. Every attempt to justify a belief must fall into one of these categories. This realization has profound implications for how we understand knowledge, certainty, and rational belief. In science, the trilemma manifests in the problem of foundational assumptions. Scientific theories rest on assumptions about the uniformity of natural laws, the reliability of measurement instruments, and the validity of logical reasoning. These assumptions cannot be proven without circular reasoning, and demanding justification for them leads to infinite regress. Scientists typically accept these assumptions pragmatically rather than philosophically, recognizing that science is a human enterprise with practical goals rather than a quest for absolute certainty. The trilemma also illuminates challenges in everyday reasoning and debate. When people disagree about political, moral, or practical questions, they often demand that opponents provide justifications for their positions. But this demand for justification can lead to the same three unsatisfactory outcomes. Either the argument becomes circular, leads to infinite regress, or relies on assumptions that cannot themselves be justified. Different philosophical traditions have responded to the Munchausen trilemma in various ways. Foundationalists argue that some beliefs are basic and don't require justification. Typically, beliefs about immediate sensory experience or logical truths. They claim these foundational beliefs can stop the regress without being arbitrary, because they have special epistemic properties that make them self-justifying. Coherentists reject the foundationalist approach, arguing instead that beliefs are justified by how well they fit together in a coherent system. From this perspective, beliefs don't need individual foundations, because they support each other within a web of interconnected ideas. However, critics argue that coherentism cannot escape circularity, since the beliefs within the system ultimately justify each other. Infinitists embrace infinite regress, arguing that justification chains can be infinite, and that this doesn't necessarily undermine knowledge. They contend that as long as we can always provide some justification when challenged, the inability to complete an infinite chain doesn't invalidate our beliefs. Critics respond that infinite justification is psychologically impossible for finite minds and provides no practical guidance for evaluating beliefs. Pragmatists sidestep the trilemma by focusing on the practical consequences of beliefs rather than their ultimate justification. From this perspective, beliefs are valuable not because they can be proven true, but because they work effectively in practice. This approach acknowledges the trilemma while arguing that the quest for absolute justification is misguided. Skeptics use the trilemma to argue that certain knowledge is impossible, and that we should suspend judgment on questions that cannot be definitively resolved. While this position avoids the logical problems of the trilemma, it can lead to paralysis in practical decision-making and seems to conflict with our everyday experience of knowing many things with high confidence. The trilemma has particular relevance in our digital age, where information proliferation makes questions of justification more pressing than ever. Social media platforms and search engines shape what information we encounter, creating potential bubbles of circular reasoning where we encounter primarily information that confirms what we already believe. The democratization of information has made it easier than ever to find support for almost any belief, regardless of its truth value. Modern epistemology has developed more nuanced approaches to these challenges. Reliabilism suggests that beliefs are justified if they are produced by reliable processes, even if we cannot fully justify those processes themselves. Virtue epistemology focuses on the character traits of good thinkers, rather than the logical structure of justification. These approaches acknowledge the trilemma, while developing alternative frameworks for understanding knowledge and rational belief. The trilemma also connects to contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and machine learning. As we develop systems that can process vast amounts of information and identify patterns, we must consider how these systems justify their conclusions. Machine learning algorithms often make decisions based on complex webs of interconnected factors that resist simple explanation, raising new questions about the nature of justification in an age of artificial intelligence. Perhaps the most important insight of the Munchausen trilemma is that it reveals the inherent limitations of human reasoning while simultaneously demonstrating the remarkable achievement of human knowledge. Despite the logical impossibility of absolute justification, humans have developed increasingly sophisticated ways of understanding the world, building technologies, creating art, and forming societies. The trilemma teaches us intellectual humility. The recognition that our knowledge, however extensive and useful, rests on foundations that cannot be absolutely secured. This humility need not lead to skepticism or paralysis, but can instead inspire a more nuanced appreciation for the complexity of knowledge and the importance of remaining open to new evidence and alternative perspectives. As we navigate a world filled with competing claims about truth, the Munchausen trilemma reminds us to approach all beliefs, including our own, with appropriate caution and curiosity. It encourages us to value evidence and reasoning while recognizing their limitations, to seek the best available justifications while acknowledging their incompleteness, and to remain humble about the ultimate foundations of what we think we know. The trilemma doesn't close the door on knowledge, but opens it to a more sophisticated understanding of what knowledge means and how it operates in human life. It invites us to embrace both the power and the limits of human reasoning, finding wisdom not in absolute certainty, but in the ongoing quest for better understanding. The problem of evil. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, a mother sits beside her child's hospital bed. The machines beep softly, marking time in a rhythm that has become her world. She watches her daughter's small chest rise and fall, each breath a mixture of hope and fear. In this sterile room, surrounded by the architecture of human compassion and medical science, an ancient question burns with immediate urgency. If God is all-loving and all-powerful, why does this suffering exist? This scene, repeated countless times throughout human history, embodies one of philosophy's most enduring and emotionally challenging puzzles: the problem of evil. It's a question that has tested the faith of believers, provided ammunition for skeptics, and challenged theologians for millennia. The problem is elegant in its simplicity, yet devastating in its implications. The classical formulation presents what seems like an ironclad logical argument. If God possesses three attributes that most religious traditions ascribe to the divine: omnipotence, all-powerful; omniscience, all-knowing; and omnibenevolence, all-loving, then evil and suffering should not exist. An all-loving God would want to eliminate suffering. An all-powerful God would have the ability to eliminate it. An all-knowing God would be aware of all suffering and know how to prevent it. Yet suffering persists throughout the world in forms that seem gratuitous, meaningless, and cruel. To fully appreciate the depth of this problem, we must consider the different types of evil that challenge divine goodness. Moral evil encompasses the suffering that humans inflict upon each other: war, murder, cruelty, deception, and oppression. These actions seem to flow from human choices and could presumably be prevented by divine intervention without eliminating human freedom entirely. Natural evil presents an even more challenging category. Earthquakes that bury entire cities, diseases that ravage the innocent, storms that destroy communities, and the countless forms of suffering built into the very structure of the natural world. A tsunami doesn't choose its victims based on their moral character. Cancer doesn't discriminate between the virtuous and the wicked. These forms of suffering seem particularly difficult to reconcile with the idea of a loving creator. Perhaps most troubling is what philosophers call gratuitous evil. Suffering that serves no apparent purpose, contributes to no greater good, and seems utterly meaningless. The death of a child from genetic disease, the agony of animals in natural disasters, the psychological torment of innocent victims. These experiences challenge our deepest assumptions about justice, meaning, and divine love. Believers and theologians have developed numerous responses to this challenge, each attempting to preserve divine attributes while acknowledging the reality of suffering. These responses, known as theodicies, represent some of the most sophisticated thinking in human intellectual history. The free will defense, perhaps the most influential theodicy, argues that God permits evil as a necessary consequence of granting humans genuine freedom. According to this view, God could have created beings incapable of evil, but such beings would be essentially robots, incapable of genuine love, moral growth, or meaningful relationships. The capacity for evil is the price of authentic goodness. Consider the difference between a programmed expression of affection and a freely chosen act of love. A computer can be programmed to display the words, "I love you," but this expression lacks the meaning that comes from choice. Similarly, this theodicy argues, God values genuine virtue over programmed behavior, even though genuine virtue requires the possibility of vice. The free will defense handles moral evil relatively well, but natural evil presents greater challenges. Why would a loving God create a world where natural disasters cause suffering independently of human choices? Some theologians argue that natural laws, like moral freedom, are necessary for a world that supports genuine choice and meaningful action. A world where natural laws could be arbitrarily suspended to prevent suffering might be a world where human actions lose their significance and consequences. The soul-making theodicy, developed by philosopher John Hick, suggests that suffering serves a crucial role in human spiritual development. From this perspective, the world is not intended as a paradise, but as a vale of soul-making, where challenges and difficulties provide opportunities for growth, compassion, and moral development. This theodicy finds support in human experience. Many people report that their most difficult experiences led to their greatest personal growth. Suffering often develops empathy, resilience, and wisdom in ways that comfort cannot. The person who has never faced adversity might lack the depth of character that comes from overcoming challenges. Yet critics note that this explanation seems inadequate to account for the extremity and distribution of suffering. Why do some people face overwhelming challenges while others live relatively comfortable lives? How does the suffering of infants, or those with severe cognitive disabilities, contribute to their spiritual development? The soul-making theodicy seems to work better for some forms of suffering than others. The greater good defense proposes that what appears to us as unnecessary suffering might serve purposes we cannot comprehend. From a divine perspective that encompasses all of history and eternity, events that seem tragic might contribute to a greater good that finite human minds cannot grasp. This defense draws on the recognition that human knowledge and perspective are inherently limited. We see only small pieces of a vast cosmic tapestry, and cannot judge the overall pattern from our narrow vantage point. What seems like meaningless suffering might play a crucial role in a divine plan that extends far beyond our understanding. However, this defense raises troubling questions about the nature of divine goodness. If God's goodness is so different from human conceptions of goodness that it allows for what we perceive as gratuitous suffering, In what sense can we call it good at all? The defense risks making divine goodness so mysterious as to be meaningless. Some theologians propose the constraint defense, arguing that even omnipotence might face logical limitations. Perhaps God cannot create a world with free creatures that never choose evil, just as God cannot create square circles or married bachelors. From this perspective, the existence of evil doesn't challenge divine power, but reveals the logical constraints within which even omnipotence must operate. This approach preserves God's goodness by suggesting that the divine faces genuine trade-offs. A world with free creatures capable of love necessarily includes the possibility of hatred. A world with natural laws that support life necessarily includes the possibility of natural disasters. God chooses the best possible world given these constraints, even though that world includes suffering. The skeptical theist response takes a different approach, arguing that human beings are simply incapable of judging divine purposes. Our cognitive limitations, temporal perspective, and moral understanding are so constrained compared to divine knowledge that we cannot reasonably expect to comprehend the reasons for suffering. From this view, the existence of apparently gratuitous suffering doesn't provide evidence against God's existence, because we lack the capacity to recognize how that suffering might serve divine purposes. This response has both philosophical and practical dimensions. Philosophically, it emphasizes the enormous gap between finite and infinite understanding. Practically, it allows believers to maintain faith despite encountering suffering they cannot explain or justify. Critics argue that skeptical theism undermines the possibility of any positive knowledge about divine attributes. If we cannot trust our moral intuitions about suffering, how can we trust them about divine goodness? The position might preserve belief in God, but at the cost of making that belief essentially contentless. Process theologians offer a radically different solution by reconceptualizing divine power. They argue that God is not omnipotent in the traditional sense, but instead works within and alongside natural processes. God influences the world through persuasion rather than coercion, seeking to maximize value and minimize suffering within the constraints of a dynamic, evolving universe. This approach solves the logical problem of evil by denying one of its premises, that God is omnipotent in the classical sense. If God lacks the power to unilaterally prevent all suffering, then the existence of suffering doesn't contradict divine love. However, this solution comes at the cost of traditional ideas about divine sovereignty and power. The problem of evil has spawned numerous variations and related puzzles. The problem of divine hiddenness asks why a loving God would remain hidden from creatures who seek relationship with the divine. The problem of hell questions how eternal punishment could be compatible with infinite love. The problem of animal suffering challenges theodicies that depend on human spiritual development by pointing to the vast suffering of non-human creatures. Contemporary philosophers have developed increasingly sophisticated versions of the problem. The evidential problem of evil acknowledges that the existence of some evil might be compatible with divine goodness, but argues that the amount and distribution of evil in our world provides strong evidence against the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God. The problem of evil has profound practical implications beyond its theoretical interest. It shapes how people understand their suffering, how they relate to religious faith, and how they construct meaning in the face of tragedy. For many, the problem represents not just an intellectual puzzle, but an existential crisis that challenges their deepest beliefs about the nature of reality. Some people find that wrestling with the problem deepens their faith, leading to more nuanced and mature religious beliefs. Others find that the problem undermines their belief in traditional concepts of God, leading them towards skepticism, alternative spiritual frameworks, or entirely secular worldviews. The problem of evil also connects to broader questions about meaning and purpose in human existence. If there is no divine plan that justifies suffering, how do we create meaning in the face of tragedy? How do we maintain hope when confronted with seemingly senseless pain? These questions extend beyond religious belief to touch on fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization. Perhaps most importantly, the problem of evil reminds us that intellectual puzzles are never merely academic when they touch on human suffering. Behind every theological argument lies a real person facing real pain, seeking real answers to questions that matter deeply. The problem challenges us to hold both intellectual rigor and emotional compassion, to think clearly while remaining sensitive to the human stakes involved. As we wrestle with these ancient questions, we might find that the problem of evil teaches us something unexpected, that the deepest truths about existence might not yield to simple solutions. The persistence of the problem across millennia of sophisticated thinking suggests that reality itself might be more complex, more mysterious, and more ambiguous than our conceptual frameworks can fully capture. Whether one emerges from this exploration with renewed faith, deepened skepticism, or something altogether different, the problem of evil serves as a crucial test of our beliefs about justice, love, power, and meaning. It forces us to confront the gap between the world as we wish it were and the world as we find it, challenging us to respond with both honesty and hope. The unexpected gift paradox. Imagine receiving a phone call on a Sunday evening. The voice on the other end belongs to a dear friend who announces with barely contained excitement, "I have wonderful news. Sometime between Monday and Friday of this week, you're going to receive a surprise gift. But here's the key. It will arrive on a day when you least expect it." You hang up the phone with a smile, already beginning to wonder what this mysterious gift might be and when it might arrive. But as you start to think through the possibilities, something strange happens. Your mind, that remarkable instrument of logic and analysis, begins to work against the very possibility of surprise. The reasoning starts innocently enough. You consider Friday, the last possible day for the gift's arrival. If Thursday evening comes and goes without any gift, you'll know with certainty that it must arrive on Friday. But if you're expecting it on Friday, it can no longer be a surprise. Therefore, Friday is eliminated as a possibility. With Friday ruled out, Thursday becomes the last possible day. But now the same logic applies. If Wednesday evening passes without a gift, you'll expect it on Thursday, which means Thursday can't be a surprise either. Following this reasoning to its logical conclusion, you systematically eliminate Wednesday, then Tuesday, then Monday. By the end of this mental exercise, it seems impossible for any gift to arrive as a surprise. Yet here's where the paradox reveals its most fascinating aspect. Despite your logical reasoning, if the gift actually arrives on, say, Wednesday morning, you'll likely be genuinely surprised. Your reasoning convinced you that no surprise was possible, so the actual arrival catches you off guard. The gift succeeds in being surprising precisely because your logic told you it couldn't be. This paradox, known variously as the unexpected gift paradox, the surprise test paradox, or the unexpected hanging paradox, exposes a fascinating tension between logical reasoning and lived experience. It demonstrates how our attempts to predict and control outcomes can sometimes undermine the very experiences we're trying to understand. The paradox gained widespread attention in academic circles through the work of philosophers and logicians who recognized its implications for broader questions about knowledge, prediction, and self-reference. But its roots extend much deeper, touching on fundamental aspects of how consciousness relates to temporality and uncertainty. Consider how the paradox illuminates the nature of expectation itself. What does it mean to expect something? In everyday language, expectation involves a degree of confidence about future events. But the paradox reveals that expectation is more complex than simple prediction. It involves not just beliefs about what will happen, but beliefs about our own beliefs, creating layers of self-reference that can lead to logical tangles. The temporal dimension of the paradox is equally fascinating. The reasoning that eliminates each day as a possibility depends on a specific relationship between knowledge and time. It assumes that we can use our knowledge at one moment to determine what we'll know at future moments. But this assumption might itself be problematic, as it treats knowledge as more static and predictable than it actually is. Let's explore a variation that makes the temporal complexities even clearer. Suppose you receive a more specific prediction. The gift will arrive at a random time between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on a day this week, and you'll be surprised when it happens. Now the reasoning becomes more complex. Even if you know the gift must arrive on Friday, because the week is ending, the exact timing within that day remains uncertain. Can partial uncertainty preserve surprise even when the general time frame is predictable? This variation suggests that surprise might be more resilient than the classical paradox implies. Complete logical elimination of surprise requires complete predictability, but real-world situations rarely offer such certainty. The gift giver might change their mind, delay the delivery, or choose a method of delivery you didn't anticipate. These practical uncertainties can preserve surprise even when abstract logical reasoning suggests it should be impossible. The paradox also connects to deeper questions about the relationship between logic and psychology. The logical argument against surprise seems airtight, yet psychological research shows that people can indeed be surprised by events they've reasoned should be unsurprising. This disconnect reveals the gap between formal logical systems and the way human minds actually process information and experience. Cognitive scientists have identified numerous ways that human reasoning deviates from formal logic. We engage in satisficing rather than optimizing, meaning we often settle for solutions that are good enough rather than pursuing perfect logical consistency. We are influenced by emotions, social contexts, and cognitive biases that can override pure logical reasoning. These flaws in human reasoning might actually be features that preserve our capacity for surprise and wonder. The paradox takes on additional dimensions when we consider its social aspects. The surprise depends not just on logical reasoning, but on trust between the gift giver and recipient. If you trust your friend to follow through on their promise, you might not engage in the logical reasoning that eliminates surprise. Conversely, if you doubt their reliability, you might dismiss the entire scenario, again preserving the possibility of surprise if the gift actually arrives. Game theory provides another lens for understanding the paradox. If both the gift giver and recipient are rational actors trying to optimize their outcomes, the situation becomes a strategic interaction where each party's reasoning must account for the other's reasoning. The gift giver, knowing that the recipient will engage in the logical reasoning that eliminates surprise, might deliberately violate the stated conditions to preserve surprise. This creates a kind of recursive reasoning where each party tries to outthink the other. The paradox has practical implications that extend far beyond hypothetical gifts. Consider its relevance to strategic planning in business or military contexts. If a competitor knows you're planning a surprise attack or product launch, and they know you know they know, the entire strategic calculation changes. The logic of the surprise paradox helps explain why successful surprises often require not just secrecy, but misdirection and the violation of apparent logical patterns. Educational contexts provide another practical application. Teachers often announce surprise quizzes or tests, creating a similar logical structure. Students might reason that a surprise test can't occur on the last possible day because they'd expect it then. But this reasoning can itself be surprising when teachers violate its assumptions or when students fail to follow the logic consistently. The paradox also illuminates the role of attention and memory in shaping experience. Even if you've logically reasoned that a gift should arrive on a particular day, you might become absorbed in other activities and temporarily forget your reasoning. This lapse in attention can restore the possibility of surprise, suggesting that surprise depends not just on logical knowledge, but on the active maintenance of that knowledge in consciousness. Philosophers have proposed various solutions to the paradox, each highlighting different aspects of the problem. Some argue that the paradox reveals the limits of self-referential reasoning, when our reasoning becomes too recursive. When we think about thinking, it can create logical loops that don't correspond to reality. Others suggest that the paradox demonstrates the importance of distinguishing between different types of knowledge. Knowing that a gift will arrive is different from knowing when it will arrive, which is different from knowing that you know when it will arrive. These epistemic distinctions might resolve the paradox by showing that complete surprise, eliminating knowledge, is harder to achieve than the simple formulation suggests. Still others propose that the paradox reveals fundamental features of temporality and consciousness. Our experience of time is not the linear, predictable sequence that logical reasoning assumes. Instead, it's characterized by discontinuities, surprises, and emergent properties that resist complete logical control. From this perspective, the paradox illustrates the limits of applying timeless logical reasoning to temporal phenomena. The paradox connects to broader philosophical questions about determinism and free will. If the future is completely determined by present conditions, then perfect knowledge of those conditions should enable perfect prediction, eliminating all surprise. But the paradox suggests that even in a deterministic universe, the recursive nature of self-aware consciousness can preserve surprise and unpredictability. Modern physics adds another layer of complexity to these questions. Quantum mechanics suggests that certain events are fundamentally random, rather than merely unpredictable due to incomplete information. If quantum effects influence human decision-making, then perfect prediction might be impossible even in principle, preserving space for genuine surprise regardless of logical reasoning. The information-theoretic aspects of the paradox are equally fascinating. Surprise is closely related to information content. Events that are highly predictable carry little information, while surprising events carry more. The paradox suggests that the very act of reasoning about surprise might change the information content of future events, creating a kind of observer effect in the realm of logic and epistemology. As we grapple with the unexpected gift paradox, we encounter fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, time, and consciousness. The paradox reveals that even seemingly simple scenarios can contain deep complexities when subjected to rigorous analysis. It reminds us that logical reasoning, while powerful, has limits, especially when applied to phenomena that involve self-reference, temporality, and consciousness. Perhaps most importantly, the paradox preserves a space for wonder in an increasingly analyzed and predictable world. It suggests that surprise, creativity, and genuine novelty might be more resilient than our logical frameworks predict. In a world where big data and artificial intelligence promise to make everything predictable, the unexpected gift paradox offers a reassuring reminder that mystery and surprise might be ineradicable features of conscious existence. The paradox teaches us to hold our logical reasoning lightly, recognizing its power while acknowledging its limits. It invites us to remain open to surprise, even when our reasoning suggests it's impossible. In doing so, it preserves space for the unexpected gifts that make life rich, meaningful, and endlessly fascinating. The Drinker's Paradox. Picture a dimly lit tavern on a foggy evening, the kind of establishment where strangers become philosophers over shared drinks and heated debates spark over the most abstract questions. The air is thick with pipe smoke and passionate discourse. In one corner, a group of patrons argues about mathematics. In another, they debate the nature of justice. Tonight, however, the conversation has turned to a seemingly absurd claim that has silenced even the most argumentative customers. Someone has just declared, "In this very bar, there exists at least one person, such that if that person drinks, then everyone else in the bar drinks as well." The statement hangs in the air like a challenge to common sense. How could one person's drinking behavior control everyone else's? Yet surprisingly, this bizarre claim is not only possibly true, it's necessarily true, according to the rigid laws of logic. This is the essence of the Drinker's Paradox, a logical puzzle that demonstrates how formal reasoning can lead to conclusions that seem to violate our everyday understanding of cause and effect. The paradox isn't really about drinking, of course. It's about the strange world of logical implication and how our mathematical systems can generate truths that feel alien to human experience. To understand why this seemingly absurd statement must be true, we need to delve into the mechanics of logical implication. In formal logic, a statement of the form, "if A then B," is considered true in all cases except when A is true and B is false. This might seem like a technical detail, but it has profound consequences for how we understand logical truth. Let's examine the tavern scenario more carefully. The claim states that there exists someone such that if that person drinks, then everyone drinks. Now imagine we survey the bar and find that everyone is already drinking. In this case, we can point to any patron and truthfully say, if this person drinks, then everyone drinks. Because everyone is indeed drinking. The implication holds regardless of whether that particular person's drinking caused everyone else to drink. But what if not everyone in the bar is drinking? Perhaps some patrons are nursing soft drinks or have sworn off alcohol entirely. Here's where the logic becomes counterintuitive. Consider one of the non-drinkers. Let's call him Thomas. We can truthfully say, if Thomas drinks, then everyone drinks. How can this be true when Thomas manifestly isn't drinking and everyone manifestly isn't drinking? The answer lies in understanding how logical implication works. Since Thomas isn't drinking, the condition Thomas drinks is false. In logic, when the condition of an implication is false, the entire implication is automatically considered true, regardless of what the consequence claims. This isn't because Thomas is drinking would actually cause everyone to drink, but because the logical structure makes the statement vacuously true. This concept of vacuous truth is central to understanding the drinker's paradox. A statement is vacuously true when its condition is never met, making it impossible to find a counterexample. It's like saying, all unicorns in this room are purple. A statement that's technically true because there are no unicorns in the room to serve as counterexamples. The paradox reveals a fundamental disconnect between logical truth and causal truth. In logic, if P then Q doesn't require any causal connection between P and Q, it simply describes a relationship between truth values. In contrast, our everyday reasoning typically assumes that if-then statements describe causal relationships, or at least meaningful dependencies between events. Consider how this disconnect manifests in other contexts. We could truthfully say, if the moon is made of cheese, then 2 + 2 = 4. This statement is logically true because the moon isn't made of cheese, making the condition false, and 2 + 2 does equal 4, making the consequence true. Yet the statement feels meaningless because there's no connection between lunar composition and arithmetic facts. The drinker's paradox illustrates this same principle, but packages it in a way that seems to describe a social scenario. Our minds naturally interpret statements about people's behavior as claims about psychology, social influence, or causal relationships. When logic generates statements that mimic these familiar patterns while operating according to different rules, the result feels paradoxical. This tension between logical and psychological reasoning appears throughout mathematics and philosophy. Consider the mathematical statement, for all x, if x is both even and odd, then x = 17. This statement is mathematically true because no number can be both even and odd, making the condition impossible to satisfy. Yet, the statement seems to claim something meaningful about numbers and arithmetic. The paradox also highlights the role of quantifiers in logical reasoning. The original statement claims that there exists someone with the specified property. This existential claim is satisfied as long as we can find one person who fits the description. Whether that person actually has any causal influence over others' drinking behavior is irrelevant to the logical truth of the statement. Existential quantification often leads to counterintuitive results in formal logic. Consider the statement, there exists a person such that if that person is happy, then everyone is happy. Logic tells us this statement must be true, but finding the specific person requires understanding the logical structure rather than identifying genuine causal agents of universal happiness. The drinker's paradox connects to deeper questions about the relationship between mathematical reasoning and empirical reality. Mathematics provides powerful tools for modeling and understanding the world, but mathematical truths don't always correspond directly to physical or social facts. The paradox reminds us that logical systems operate according to their own internal rules, which may or may not align with our intuitive understanding of how the world works. This disconnect becomes particularly relevant in an age of artificial intelligence and automated reasoning. Computer systems that process natural language must navigate the gap between logical truth and contextual meaning. A system that interprets the drinker's paradox literally might draw bizarre conclusions about social influence and drinking behavior, while a system that dismisses it entirely might miss important logical relationships. The paradox also illuminates the challenges of translating between formal and natural languages. When we express logical relationships in everyday language, we often import assumptions about causation, intention, and social reality that aren't present in the formal system. This translation process can create confusion about what statements actually mean and what they imply about the world. Philosophers have used the drinker's paradox to explore questions about truth, meaning, and the foundations of logic itself. Some argue that the paradox reveals problems with classical logic, suggesting that our formal systems generate too many true statements that lack meaningful content. Others contend that the paradox simply demonstrates the need for careful distinction between logical truth and other types of truth claims. The paradox has practical implications for how we understand argument and persuasion in everyday life. Politicians, advertisers, and other communicators sometimes exploit the gap between logical validity and meaningful content, crafting statements that are technically true but misleading. Understanding paradoxes like the drinker's paradox can help us become more sophisticated consumers of logical arguments. Educational contexts provide another arena where the paradox proves relevant. Students learning formal logic often struggle with the disconnect between logical truth and intuitive reasoning. The drinker's paradox serves as a vivid example of how mathematical systems can generate unexpected results, helping students develop more nuanced understanding of logical reasoning. The paradox also connects to contemporary debates about the nature of computation and artificial intelligence. As we develop systems that can process logical arguments and generate proofs, we must grapple with questions about when logical truth corresponds to meaningful truth. The drinker's paradox illustrates how formal systems can generate statements that are logically valid but practically meaningless. Game theory provides another lens for examining the paradox. If we interpret the tavern scenario as a strategic interaction where people's drinking decisions influence others, the logical structure might miss crucial aspects of how social influence actually operates. Real social situations involve psychology, emotion, and complex feedback loops that formal logic abstracts away. Cross-cultural perspectives add yet another dimension to understanding the paradox. Different cultures have varying approaches to logical reasoning and different assumptions about causation and social influence. The drinker's paradox might feel more or less paradoxical, depending on one's cultural background and the logical traditions one has internalized. The paradox ultimately teaches us humility about the relationship between human reasoning and formal logical systems. While logic provides powerful tools for analysis and reasoning, it operates according to rules that sometimes conflict with our intuitive understanding of the world. Recognizing these conflicts doesn't require abandoning logic, but rather developing more sophisticated appreciation for its strengths and limitations. As we navigate an increasingly complex world filled with logical arguments, statistical claims, and automated reasoning systems, the drinker's paradox reminds us to distinguish between different types of truth. Logical truth, empirical truth, psychological truth, and social truth operate according to different rules and serve different purposes in human life. The paradox invites us to become more thoughtful consumers and producers of logical arguments. It encourages us to ask not just whether statements are logically valid, but whether they're meaningful, relevant, and helpful for understanding the phenomena we care about. In doing so, it helps us develop the kind of intellectual sophistication needed to thrive in a world where logic and life intersect in increasingly complex ways. The Island of Truth Tellers and Liars. On a remote island shrouded in perpetual mist, where ancient olive trees whisper secrets to the wind, and marble pathways lead to temples dedicated to forgotten gods, lives a peculiar population divided into two distinct groups. Every inhabitant belongs to one of these categories. They are either truth tellers who speak only the truth, or liars who speak only falsehoods. No middle ground exists. No partial truths, no well-intentioned deceptions, no white lies to spare feelings. Each person is bound by an immutable nature that determines every word they speak. You find yourself washed ashore on this island after a shipwreck, with no memory of how you arrived, but with an urgent need to understand this strange society. Your survival may depend on distinguishing between those who can be trusted and those who cannot. Yet, as you attempt your first conversations with the islanders, you quickly discover that this seemingly simple task presents profound logical challenges. The fundamental problem emerges immediately when you approach your first islander and ask the most obvious question: are you a truth teller? Consider what responses you might receive. A truth teller, bound by their nature to speak only truth, would honestly answer yes. But a liar, compelled to speak only falsehoods, would also answer yes. Because claiming to be a truth teller would be a lie, which is exactly what liars do. This realization strikes like a thunderbolt. Direct questions about truthfulness yield identical responses from both groups, making them useless for distinguishing between truth-tellers and liars. The very act of asking someone about their own honesty creates a logical structure that prevents meaningful differentiation. You've encountered your first taste of the deep logical puzzles that govern life on this mysterious island. But logic, that most powerful tool of human reasoning, offers more sophisticated approaches to this challenge. The key lies in constructing questions that force truth-tellers and liars to give different answers, even when both are trying to appear truthful or both are constrained by their natures. Imagine you encounter two islanders standing together. Let's call them Elena and Marcus. You devise a clever strategy. You ask Elena, "What would Marcus say if I asked him whether you are a truth-teller?" This question creates a logical structure that compels truth-tellers and liars to respond differently, regardless of what type of person Marcus might be. Let's trace through the logic carefully. If Elena is a truth-teller, she will honestly report what Marcus would say. If Marcus is also a truth-teller, he would truthfully say that Elena is a truth-teller, and Elena would honestly report this. But if Marcus is a liar, he would falsely claim that Elena is a liar, and Elena would honestly report this false claim. Now consider the case where Elena is a liar. She must lie about what Marcus would say. If Marcus is a truth-teller, he would honestly say that Elena is a liar, but Elena must lie about this and claim that Marcus would call her a truth-teller. If Marcus is also a liar, he would falsely claim that Elena is a truth-teller. But Elena must lie about this and say that Marcus would call her a liar. Through this complex logical dance, you can determine Elena's nature by analyzing the pattern of her response. The question forces truth-tellers and liars into different logical positions, creating a method for distinguishing between them despite their initial identical responses to direct questions. This breakthrough illuminates a profound principle. Solving the truth-teller and liar puzzle requires abandoning direct approaches in favor of indirect, self-referential questions that exploit the logical relationships between different statements. The solution emerges not from trying to get islanders to reveal their nature directly, but from creating logical structures where their nature manifests through the patterns of their responses. The island puzzle becomes even more intricate when you encounter larger groups of islanders. Imagine walking into a village square where 5 people are engaged in animated conversation. How do you determine which are truth-tellers and which are liars when you can't rely on direct questioning? The challenge requires systematic logical reasoning that builds understanding gradually through multiple interactions. One approach involves using what logicians call bootstrapping, starting with uncertain information and gradually building toward greater certainty. You might begin by asking one person what another person would say about a third person's nature. While this doesn't immediately reveal everyone's type, it creates logical constraints that limit the possible combinations. By asking multiple such questions and tracking the patterns of responses, you can eventually determine everyone's nature through process of elimination. The puzzle also reveals fascinating insights about the nature of truth itself. In the world of the island, truth becomes a logical property rather than a correspondence to reality. Truth-tellers aren't necessarily wise, well-informed, or morally good. They simply happen to be incapable of making false statements. Similarly, liars aren't necessarily malicious or deceptive in intent. They're simply bound by a nature that compels them to make false statements. This abstraction helps us understand how logical systems can operate independently of the psychological and moral dimensions we usually associate with truth and falsehood. The island creates a pure logical environment where questions of motivation, knowledge, and intention become irrelevant to the fundamental structure of the puzzle. The truth-teller and liar puzzle has profound implications for understanding communication and epistemology in the real world. While we rarely encounter people who are absolutely truthful or absolutely deceptive, we do navigate situations where we must assess the reliability of information sources. The logical principles illustrated by the island puzzle provide tools for these more nuanced real-world challenges. Consider how these principles apply to evaluating news sources, political statements, or expert testimony. While real-world information sources aren't perfectly reliable or unreliable, we can still use logical reasoning to cross-reference claims, identify inconsistencies, and build more confident assessments of truthfulness. The island puzzle teaches us to look for patterns and relationships between statements rather than relying on isolated claims. The puzzle also illuminates the role of self-reference in logical reasoning. Many of the most effective questions for distinguishing truth-tellers from liars involve asking people to make statements about what other people would say about them. This creates multiple layers of reference that can be analyzed logically even when individual layers remain ambiguous. Self-reference appears throughout mathematics, philosophy, and computer science as a source of both power and paradox. The island puzzle demonstrates how self-referential structures can be harnessed to extract information from seemingly intractable situations. This principle has applications in everything from cryptography to artificial intelligence, where systems must often reason about their own reasoning processes. The temporal dimension of the puzzle adds another layer of complexity. If you encounter the same islanders repeatedly over time, their consistent behavior patterns provide additional evidence about their nature. A person who always makes statements that turn out to be true is likely a truth teller, while someone whose statements consistently prove false is probably a liar. This longitudinal approach complements the logical techniques for immediate assessment. However, the puzzle also reveals the limits of logical reasoning when applied to human behavior. Real people are neither perfectly truthful nor perfectly deceptive. They have complex motivations, varying degrees of knowledge, and different relationships to truth depending on context. The clean, logical structure of the island puzzle doesn't directly translate to the messy realities of human communication. Modern variations of the puzzle introduce additional complexity by including random types, people who sometimes tell the truth and sometimes lie according to no discernible pattern. These variations challenge even more sophisticated logical reasoning and require statistical approaches alongside pure logic. They better approximate real-world situations where people's relationship to truth is complex and contextual. The puzzle has inspired extensive research in computer science, particularly in areas related to distributed computing and Byzantine fault tolerance. When computer systems must coordinate despite the possibility that some components might be malfunctioning or compromised, they face challenges analogous to the truth-teller and liar puzzle. The logical techniques developed for the island puzzle have practical applications in designing robust computer networks. Artificial intelligence systems also encounter versions of this puzzle when processing information from multiple sources of varying reliability. Natural language processing systems must often assess the credibility of different information sources and reconcile conflicting claims. The principles illustrated by the island puzzle provide foundational approaches for these challenges. The educational value of the truth-teller and liar puzzle extends beyond its logical content. Working through the puzzle develops crucial critical thinking skills, including the ability to analyze complex logical relationships, resist the temptation to make assumptions, and approach problems systematically. These skills transfer to many domains where careful reasoning is essential. The puzzle also demonstrates the importance of precise language and clear definitions. The clean logical structure depends on the absolute nature of the truth-teller and liar categories. Real-world applications require similar precision in defining terms and conditions, even when the reality being modeled is more complex and ambiguous. Cultural perspectives on truth and deception add fascinating dimensions to the puzzle. Different cultures have varying tolerances for indirect communication, contextual truth, and strategic ambiguity. The island puzzle's emphasis on absolute truth and falsehood reflects particular cultural assumptions about communication that might not apply universally. Philosophical traditions have long debated the nature of truth itself, whether truth corresponds to objective reality, coheres with other beliefs, or serves pragmatic functions in human life. The island puzzle sidesteps these deeper questions by defining truth purely in terms of logical consistency, but it implicitly raises questions about what we mean when we call statements true or false. Game theory provides another lens for analyzing the puzzle. If we consider the interactions between investigators and islanders as strategic games, we can analyze optimal strategies for both revealing and concealing information. This perspective adds psychological realism to the logical structure, considering how rational agents might behave in such scenarios. The puzzle ultimately teaches us that logical reasoning can provide powerful tools for navigating uncertainty and deception, but these tools require careful application and clear understanding of their limitations. The clean, logical world of the island provides insights that can inform our approach to more complex real-world challenges, but always with the recognition that reality rarely conforms to such tidy categories. Yes, as you imagine yourself finally mastering the logical principles needed to navigate the island successfully, you might reflect on how this strange place has changed your understanding of truth, communication, and reasoning itself. The island serves as a laboratory for exploring the fundamental structures of logic and language, offering insights that extend far beyond its misty shores into the complexities of human communication and understanding. The Epimenides Paradox. In the ancient Mediterranean, where philosophers gathered in marble courtyards and ideas flowed as freely as wine, a curious figure emerged who would inadvertently create one of logic's most enduring puzzles. Epimenides, a poet and philosopher from the island of Crete, made a statement so deceptively simple that it would confound thinkers for millennia. All Cretans are liars. The statement seems straightforward enough. A man from Crete making a claim about the character of his fellow islanders. Perhaps he had grown frustrated with the political machinations of his homeland, or maybe he was indulging in the kind of self-deprecating humor that deflects criticism. But as soon as philosophers began examining this seemingly innocuous claim, they discovered something that would shake the foundations of logical reasoning itself. The problem emerges when we ask a simple question. Is Epimenides telling the truth? If he is telling the truth, then his statement that all Cretans are liars must be accurate. But if all Cretans are liars, and Epimenides is himself a Cretan, then he must be a liar. And if he's a liar, then his statement cannot be true. But if his statement isn't true, then not all Cretans are liars, which means some Cretans, possibly including Epimenides himself, might tell the truth, which would make his statement possibly true after all. This dizzying logical loop captures the essence of what we now call the Epimenides Paradox, also known as the Liar Paradox. It represents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of truth, language, and logical reasoning. The paradox creates a situation where a statement seems to undermine its own truth value, generating an endless cycle of contradiction that resists resolution. To understand the full implications of this paradox, let's consider a more direct version. This statement is false. If the statement is true, then it accurately describes itself as false, which would make it false. But if it's false, then its claim about being false is incorrect, which would make it true. The statement traps us in an infinite loop where truth becomes falsehood and falsehood becomes truth. This self-referential quality is crucial to understanding why the paradox is so troubling. Most statements refer to things outside themselves. The sky is blue refers to the color of the sky. It's raining refers to current weather conditions. But paradoxical statements like Epimenides' create a logical mirror where the statement reflects back on itself, creating an unstable system that cannot settle into a consistent truth value. The paradox reveals deep questions about the nature of language and meaning. Our everyday language allows us to construct self-referential statements with apparent ease. But these constructions can create logical structures that seem to violate the basic principles of rational thought. This raises fundamental questions about whether natural language is logically consistent or whether it contains inherent contradictions that undermine systematic reasoning. Philosophers and logicians have proposed numerous solutions to the Epimenides paradox, each illuminating different aspects of the problem while raising new questions. One approach involves distinguishing between different levels of language: object language and meta-language. From this perspective, statements about truth and falsehood operate at a different logical level than the statements they describe, preventing the problematic self-reference that creates the paradox. This hierarchical approach suggests that when Epimenides says all Cretans are liars, he's making a meta-statement about the truth value of statements made by Cretans, rather than a direct statement that can be evaluated for truth or falsehood. The paradox dissolves because the statement and its evaluation operate at different logical levels, preventing the self-referential loop. However, this solution comes with its own complications. It requires us to carefully categorize statements according to their logical level, and it's not always clear how to apply this categorization to natural language. Moreover, the solution seems to limit the expressive power of language by restricting self-reference, which plays important roles in human communication beyond creating paradoxes. Another approach involves embracing three-valued logic, where statements can be true, false, or neither, undefined. From this perspective, self-referential paradoxical statements simply lack a truth value rather than having contradictory truth values. This statement is false would be classified as undefined or meaningless rather than true or false. Three-valued logic provides a clean resolution to the paradox, but requires abandoning the classical principle that every meaningful statement must be either true or false. This abandonment has far-reaching implications for logical reasoning and mathematics, potentially requiring fundamental revisions to systems of thought that have proven remarkably successful in understanding the world. Some philosophers have proposed that the paradox reveals problems with the classical notion of truth itself. They argue that truth is not a simple property that statements possess or lack, but rather a more complex relationship between language, reality, and context. From this perspective, the paradox emerges from oversimplified assumptions about how truth works rather than from genuine logical contradictions. The deflationary approach to truth suggests that saying a statement is true adds nothing substantial to the statement itself. Snow is white, and it is true that snow is white convey the same information. This approach attempts to dissolve the paradox by arguing that self-referential statements about truth don't actually say anything meaningful beyond what they appear to say. However, critics point out that the deflationary approach might eliminate too much. Truth seems to play important roles in human reasoning and communication that can't be easily dismissed. Moreover, the approach might simply push the paradox to a different level, rather than genuinely resolving it. The paradox has evolved beyond its ancient origins to influence modern mathematics, computer science, and philosophy of language. In the early 20th century, mathematicians discovered that similar self-referential paradoxes could emerge within formal mathematical systems, leading to foundational crises that required complete reconceptualization of mathematical reasoning. Russell's paradox, which asks whether the set of all sets that don't contain themselves contains itself, follows the same logical structure as the Epimenides paradox. This mathematical version revealed that naive approaches to set theory generated contradictions, leading to the development of more sophisticated axiomatic systems that carefully restrict self-reference. The paradox also appears in computer science, where programs must sometimes reason about their own behavior or the behavior of other programs. The halting problem. The question of whether it's possible to determine if an arbitrary program will eventually stop running has connections to self-referential paradoxes. These connections reveal deep limits to what can be computed or determined algorithmically. Modern formal logic has developed sophisticated tools for handling self-reference while avoiding paradox. Tarski's semantic theory provides a framework for discussing truth within formal languages while maintaining logical consistency. These developments represent genuine progress in understanding the logical structure of language and reasoning, even if they don't completely eliminate the puzzles raised by the Epimenides paradox. The paradox continues to influence contemporary philosophy of language and mind. Questions about how minds can represent their own mental states, how language can refer to itself, and how conscious systems can be self-aware, all connect to the logical puzzles first identified by Epimenides over 2 millennia ago. Cognitive scientists study how human minds handle self-referential reasoning in practice. While people can generate paradoxical statements like, "This statement is false," they don't typically become paralyzed by the logical contradictions these statements create. This suggests that human reasoning might operate according to principles that are more flexible or contextual than formal logical systems. The practical implications of the Epimenides paradox extend into areas like law, politics, and ethics. Legal systems must sometimes deal with self-referential rules or laws that refer to their own application. Constitutional interpretation involves questions about how legal texts should be understood, including how they should be understood by future interpreters reading those very interpretations. Political discourse often involves statements that refer to their own truth or falsehood. When politicians claim that their opponents always lie, or when they assert that their own statements should be trusted, they create logical structures reminiscent of the Epimenides paradox. Understanding these structures can help citizens evaluate political claims more thoughtfully. The paradox also illuminates aspects of human psychology and social interaction. People routinely make statements about their own honesty or reliability, creating mild versions of the Epimenides situation. While these don't typically generate logical contradictions, they do reveal the complex relationship between self-knowledge, self-presentation, and social trust. Cultural and linguistic variations add fascinating dimensions to the paradox. Different languages handle self-reference differently, and different cultures have varying tolerances for paradox and contradiction. Some philosophical traditions embrace paradox as pointing toward deeper truths that transcend logical analysis, while others view paradox as a sign of confused thinking that should be eliminated. Eastern philosophical traditions have often been more comfortable with paradox than Western traditions. Zen koans deliberately create paradoxical situations designed to break through conventional logical thinking. From this perspective, the Epimenides paradox might be seen not as a problem to be solved, but as a pointer towards the limits of conceptual thought. The paradox raises profound questions about the relationship between language and reality. Does the existence of self-referential paradoxes reveal flaws in language that should be corrected? Or does it point toward fundamental features of how symbolic systems relate to the world they describe? This question connects to broader debates about whether logic discovers truths about reality or constructs useful tools for organizing human thought. Modern developments in artificial intelligence have given new relevance to the Epimenides paradox. As AI systems become more sophisticated, they increasingly encounter situations where they must reason about their own reasoning processes or evaluate their own outputs. Understanding how to handle self-reference without falling into paradox becomes a practical engineering challenge with real-world consequences. Machine learning systems that update their own parameters or modify their own code-face versions of the Epimenides paradox. If a system claims that its own claims are unreliable, how should it? Or we evaluate that claim? These questions are no longer purely academic, but have implications for the development of trustworthy AI systems. The paradox also connects to contemporary debates about truth and knowledge in democratic societies. In an era of competing information sources and claims about fake news, the logical structure of self-referential claims about truth and falsehood becomes politically and socially relevant. Understanding these structures can help citizens navigate complex information environments more effectively. Social media platforms must grapple with versions of the Epimenides paradox when users make claims about the platform's own truthfulness or reliability. When someone posts, "Everything on this platform is false," the platform faces questions about how to evaluate and potentially moderate such claims. The paradox reveals the complexity underlying apparently simple decisions about content moderation and fact-checking. The educational implications of the Epimenides paradox are equally significant. Teaching students to recognize and analyze self-referential paradoxes develops critical thinking skills that apply far beyond formal logic. Students learn to identify assumptions, trace the implications of arguments, and recognize when reasoning becomes circular or self-undermining. The paradox also serves as an excellent introduction to the philosophy of language and the nature of meaning. By working through the logical puzzles it creates, students gain appreciation for the complexity underlying everyday language use and the challenges involved in precise communication and reasoning. Contemporary neuroscience adds another dimension to understanding the paradox. Brain imaging studies of people reasoning through self-referential paradoxes reveal patterns of neural activity that differ from normal logical reasoning. This research might eventually illuminate why human minds can generate paradoxical statements without becoming trapped by them in the way that formal logical systems do. The paradox ultimately teaches us humility about the power and limits of logical reasoning. While logic provides essential tools for understanding the world and evaluating arguments, it also generates puzzles that resist easy resolution. This doesn't undermine the value of logical thinking, but rather enriches our understanding of how reasoning operates in complex domains. The Epimenides paradox reminds us that language, thought, and reality are more complex than they initially appear. The simple statement, "All Cretans are liars," opens doorways into fundamental questions about truth, meaning, and the nature of rational thought itself. While we may never fully resolve the paradox, grappling with it deepens our appreciation for the remarkable complexity underlying even the simplest forms of human communication and reasoning. As we continue our philosophical journey, the Epimenides paradox serves as a reminder that some of the most profound puzzles emerge from the intersection of language and logic. It challenges us to think carefully about how we use words, how we understand truth, and how we navigate the self-referential structures that appear throughout human thought and communication. The two envelopes problem. Picture yourself in an elegant study, perhaps in a Victorian mansion, where dust motes dance in shafts of afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. The mahogany desk before you holds two sealed envelopes, each containing a sum of money. The elderly gentleman who has invited you here, let's call him Professor Hartwell, explains the rules with precise, measured words that carry the weight of mathematical certainty. One envelope contains exactly twice as much money as the other, he states, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. You may choose either envelope, but once you've selected one, I'll offer you the opportunity to switch to the other. The question, my dear friend, is whether you should accept that offer. At first glance, this scenario seems to present a simple choice with clear probabilities. Before you open either envelope, both seem equally likely to contain the larger amount. Switching should offer no advantage. It's essentially a 50-50 proposition with no rational basis for preferring one option over the other. But then, Professor Hartwell adds a wrinkle that transforms this simple game into one of philosophy's most perplexing puzzles. You may, if you wish, open your chosen envelope before deciding whether to switch. This seemingly helpful addition creates a logical trap that has ensnared some of the finest mathematical minds of the past century. Let's imagine you select the envelope on the left and open it to discover $1,000. Now the professor repeats his offer. Would you like to switch to the other envelope? Here's where the paradox begins to reveal its subtle but devastating logic. You reason as follows. The other envelope contains either $500 or $2,000, each possibility equally likely. If it contains $500, switching would cost you $500. If it contains $2,000, switching would gain you $1,000. The expected value of switching is therefore $500 multiplied by 1/2, minus $500 multiplied by 1/2, plus $1,000 multiplied by 1/2. This calculation yields an expected gain of $250, suggesting that switching is advantageous. But this reasoning leads to an absurd conclusion. Regardless of what amount you find in your chosen envelope, the same logic applies. Whether you discover $10 or $10 million, the expected value calculation suggests that switching always offers an advantage. This implies that you should switch from the first envelope to the second, then switch back to the first, then switch again to the second, in an endless cycle of optimization that makes no sense. The paradox exposes a subtle but fundamental error in applying expected value calculations to situations with incomplete information. The mistake lies in treating the probabilities as if they're independent of the amount you actually observe, when in fact these probabilities must be constrained by whatever process was used to fill the envelopes originally. To understand this more clearly, consider how the envelopes might have been prepared. Professor Hartwell must have used some method to determine the amounts. Perhaps he flipped a coin to decide whether to put $100 and $200 in the envelopes, or whether to put $50 and $100. The specific method he used determines the actual probabilities involved in the problem. If Professor Hartwell used a process where he first selected a smaller amount and then created a larger amount by doubling it, the problem has a particular structure. If he selected from a finite range of possible smaller amounts, say, anywhere from $1 to $1,000, then finding $1,000 in your envelope would tell you something definitive about which envelope you've chosen. Alternatively, If Professor Hartwell used a process with an infinite range of possible amounts, the problem takes on a different character entirely. Some probability distributions over infinite ranges lead to paradoxical situations where standard expected value calculations break down or become undefined. The two envelopes. Problem illustrates a broader challenge in decision theory and probability. How to reason about probabilities when you have incomplete information about the underlying probability distribution. In many real-world situations, we must make decisions without knowing exactly how the alternatives were generated or what constraints apply to the possible outcomes. Consider a parallel situation in investment decisions. You might know that one of two investment opportunities offers returns twice as high as the other, but without knowing how these opportunities were selected or what ranges of returns are possible, you can't calculate meaningful expected values. The two envelopes problem reveals how seductive but flawed reasoning can emerge when we apply mathematical tools without sufficient attention to their underlying assumptions. The paradox also connects to fundamental questions about infinity and mathematical reasoning. Some versions of the problem involve infinite probability distributions that challenge our understanding of how expected values should be calculated. These mathematical subtleties point toward deep questions about the foundations of probability theory and decision-making under uncertainty. Bayesian approaches to the problem focus on how rational agents should update their beliefs based on new information. When you open your envelope and observe a specific amount, this observation should inform your reasoning about the probable contents of the other envelope. However, different assumptions about prior probability distributions lead to different conclusions about whether switching is advantageous. If you assume that all possible amounts are equally likely, a so-called uniform prior, you encounter mathematical difficulties because there's no uniform distribution over all positive real numbers. If you assume that smaller amounts are more likely than larger amounts, you can construct consistent probability distributions, but these lead to different conclusions about the switching strategy. Game theory provides another lens for analyzing the two envelopes problem. If you view the situation as a game between yourself and Professor Hartwell, you might consider what strategy he would use to fill the envelopes and how you should respond. This perspective reveals additional layers of strategic complexity beyond the basic probability calculations. Some game theoretic analyses suggest that the problem has no clear solution because it depends on unstated assumptions about the player's strategies and information. Professor Hartwell might have chosen the amounts specifically to create confusion, or he might have used a random process that favors certain outcomes. Without knowing his approach, you can't determine the optimal strategy. The paradox has practical implications that extend beyond abstract mathematics. Financial markets, insurance decisions, and many other real-world contexts involve similar structures where agents must choose between alternatives without complete information about how those alternatives were generated. Understanding the logical traps illustrated by the two envelopes problem can help people make better decisions in these practical contexts. Psychological research on the problem reveals interesting patterns in how people actually reason about such choices. Many people have strong intuitions about whether switching is advantageous, but these intuitions often conflict with formal mathematical analyses. The gap between intuitive and mathematical reasoning highlights the complexity of human decision-making under uncertainty. Some studies suggest that people's choices in envelope switching scenarios are influenced by factors like loss aversion, anchoring effects, and other cognitive biases that aren't captured by pure expected value calculations. These psychological factors might actually lead to better decisions in some cases, suggesting that human intuition sometimes incorporates wisdom that formal analysis misses. The problem also raises questions about the nature of rational decision-making itself. If mathematical analysis leads to paradoxical conclusions, should we trust formal reasoning or rely on other approaches? This question connects to broader debates in philosophy about the relationship between rationality, intuition, and practical wisdom. Different philosophical traditions approach this question differently. Utilitarian ethics, which emphasizes maximizing expected outcomes, might suggest following the mathematical analysis despite its counterintuitive implications. Virtue ethics might emphasize the importance of practical wisdom that recognizes the limits of formal analysis. Pragmatic approaches might focus on what works in practice rather than on theoretical consistency. The two envelopes problem belongs to a family of paradoxes that reveal the limits of expected value reasoning. The St. Petersburg paradox, which involves a game with infinite expected value, but which most people wouldn't pay much to play, raises similar questions about when expected value calculations provide reliable guidance for decision-making. These paradoxes suggest that rational decision-making might require more sophisticated frameworks than simple expected value maximization. Alternative approaches include bounded rationality, which recognizes cognitive limitations, satisficing, which focuses on finding good enough solutions rather than optimal ones, and robust decision-making, which emphasizes strategies that work well across a range of possible scenarios. Contemporary research in behavioral economics has developed numerous insights relevant to the two envelopes problem. Prospect theory, which describes how people actually make decisions under risk, incorporates psychological factors like reference point dependence and probability weighting that affect real-world choices. These insights suggest that the rational solution to the envelope problem might depend on psychological as well as mathematical considerations. The digital age has created new contexts where envelope-like problems arise. Online auctions, cryptocurrency investments, and algorithmic trading all involve situations where agents must make decisions about alternatives without complete information about how those alternatives were generated. Understanding the logical structure of the two envelopes problem can inform better approaches to these modern challenges. Artificial intelligence systems face similar challenges when they must make decisions under uncertainty. Machine learning algorithms must often choose between alternatives without complete information about the underlying data generation process. The envelope paradox reveals some of the subtle reasoning challenges that arise in these contexts. The problem also has implications for the design of experiments and data collection procedures. Researchers must often decide how to allocate resources between different investigative approaches without knowing which will prove most valuable. The envelope paradox illustrates how seemingly rational optimization strategies can lead to paradoxical conclusions when applied without sufficient attention to underlying assumptions. Legal and policy contexts provide additional applications of the reasoning patterns illustrated by the envelope problem. Judges must often choose between alternative sentences or remedies without complete information about their comparative effectiveness. Policymakers must allocate resources between different programs without knowing their relative returns. The envelope paradox reveals the complexity underlying these apparently straightforward optimization problems. The educational value of the two envelopes problem extends beyond its mathematical content. Working through the paradox develops critical thinking skills, including the ability to identify unstated assumptions, recognize the limits of formal reasoning, and appreciate the complexity of decision-making under uncertainty. These skills are valuable across many domains of human activity. The problem also serves as an excellent introduction to probability theory and decision analysis. Students working through the envelope paradox encounter fundamental concepts like expected value, conditional probability, and prior distributions in a concrete context that makes their importance clear. The paradox reveals why careful attention to assumptions and definitions is crucial in mathematical reasoning. Philosophy of science perspectives on the envelope problem illuminate broader questions about how mathematical models relate to real-world phenomena. The paradox shows how mathematical tools can generate apparently rigorous conclusions that nonetheless conflict with practical reasoning. This raises questions about when mathematical models provide reliable guidance and when they might mislead. The problem ultimately teaches us humility about the power and limits of rational analysis. While mathematical reasoning provides essential tools for understanding the world and making good decisions, it also can generate puzzles that resist easy resolution. The two envelopes problem reminds us that rational decision-making requires not just mathematical sophistication, but also practical wisdom about when and how to apply formal tools. As we reflect on the elegant study where our journey began, with Professor Hartwell's two envelopes resting quietly on the mahogany desk, we might appreciate how this simple scenario opens doorways into fundamental questions about probability, rationality, and decision-making. The paradox doesn't provide easy answers, but it deepens our understanding of the challenges involved in reasoning under uncertainty. The two envelopes problem stands as a testament to the surprising complexity that can emerge from apparently simple situations. It reminds us that careful reasoning requires attention, not just to mathematical techniques, but also to the assumptions and contexts that give those techniques meaning. In navigating a world full of uncertain choices, this paradox offers valuable lessons about the art and science of rational decision-making. The problem of the criterion. In the heart of ancient Alexandria, where the great library once stood as humanity's monument to learning, scholars gathered to debate a question that would prove more treacherous than any labyrinth. How can we know what we know? This seemingly simple inquiry opens into an abyss of logical complexity that has swallowed the certainties of philosophers for over 2 millennia. It is the problem of the criterion, a puzzle so fundamental that it strikes at the very roots of human knowledge and reasoning. Picture yourself as a young scholar entering the library's vast halls for the first time. The scrolls stretching endlessly before you contain the accumulated wisdom of civilizations. Mathematics from Babylon, philosophy from Athens, astronomy from Egypt. But as you reach for your first scroll, a grizzled old philosopher stops you with a penetrating question. How do you know that what you're about to read is true? And more troubling still, how do you know that your method for determining truth is itself reliable? This challenge embodies the problem of the criterion in its most acute form. To evaluate the truth of any claim, we need reliable criteria for distinguishing truth from falsehood. But to establish that our criteria are reliable, we need some way of evaluating their accuracy. And to evaluate their accuracy, we need criteria for evaluation. The circle closes upon itself like a serpent devouring its own tail, creating a logical structure that seems to undermine the very possibility of knowledge. The ancient skeptic Sextus Empiricus articulated this dilemma with devastating clarity. He pointed out that we seem to need two things simultaneously: knowledge of what is true and a reliable method for determining what is true. But we cannot acquire either without already possessing the other. To know what is true, we need a criterion for truth. To know that our criterion is reliable, we need to know what is true. We are trapped in a circle from which there seems to be no escape. Consider how this problem manifests in everyday attempts to acquire knowledge. Suppose you want to determine whether a particular news report is accurate. You might check it against other news sources, but this assumes that other sources are more reliable than the original, an assumption that itself requires justification. You might appeal to expert opinion, but this assumes that experts are more likely to be correct than non-experts, another assumption requiring justification. Perhaps you decide to check the report against your own observations or experiences, but this assumes that your senses and memory are reliable, that your interpretation of your experiences is accurate, and that your past experiences are relevant to current claims. Each of these assumptions opens new questions that require their own justification, leading to an endless regress of criteria needing criteria. The problem becomes even more acute when we consider fundamental principles of reasoning itself. Why should we trust logical reasoning? One might argue that logic has proven reliable in the past, but this argument uses logical reasoning to justify logical reasoning, a blatantly circular approach. Alternatively, one might argue that logic is self-evidently correct, but this appeals to intuition or immediate apprehension, which are themselves criteria that require justification. The problem of the criterion reveals a fundamental tension in human knowledge between the demand for justification and the impossibility of ultimate justification. We want our beliefs to be grounded in solid reasons, but any attempt to provide complete justification leads either to circular reasoning, infinite regress, or arbitrary stopping points. Each option seems to undermine the rational foundation we seek to establish. The circular reasoning option occurs when we use a principle to justify itself, or when we employ a chain of reasoning that eventually loops back to its starting point. We see this in many contexts: using scientific methods to validate scientific methods, employing logical principles to defend logical reasoning, or appealing to the reliability of perception to justify our trust in perceptual evidence. While such circular justification seems obviously flawed, it's remarkably difficult to avoid entirely. Even the most sophisticated philosophical and scientific systems contain elements of circularity when examined closely enough. This doesn't necessarily invalidate these systems, but it does raise questions about the nature of justification and whether perfect logical foundation is possible or necessary. The infinite regress option emerges when we demand justification for every principle and reason. Each justification requires further justification, creating an endless chain that never reaches a secure foundation. Why trust this expert? Because they have relevant credentials. Why trust the credentialing institution? Because it has a good track record. Why trust that past performance indicates future reliability? Because inductive reasoning generally works. Why trust inductive reasoning? The questions continue indefinitely. Some philosophers have embraced infinite regress, arguing that justification chains can be infinite without undermining knowledge. This infinitist position suggests that as long as we can always provide some justification when challenged, the impossibility of completing an infinite chain doesn't invalidate our beliefs. Critics respond that infinite justification is psychologically impossible for finite minds and provides no practical guidance for evaluating competing claims. The arbitrary stopping point option involves accepting certain principles or facts without further justification. We might declare certain beliefs to be self-evident, foundational, or basic in ways that don't require external support. This foundationalist approach provides a way to halt the regress of justification, but it does so by essentially giving up on the demand for universal justification. Different versions of foundationalism propose different types of basic beliefs. Empirical foundationalists might argue that immediate sensory experiences are self-justifying. When you experience pain, you can't meaningfully doubt that you're having that experience. Rational foundationalists might propose that certain logical or mathematical truths are self-evident in ways that require no external justification. However, foundationalism faces its own challenges. What makes certain beliefs basic while others require justification? Why should we trust immediate experience or rational intuition more than other sources of belief? These questions suggest that even foundational beliefs might require some form of justification, potentially recreating the very problem foundationalism was meant to solve. The problem of the criterion has profound implications for scientific reasoning, which we often consider the most reliable method for acquiring knowledge about the natural world. Science relies on empirical observation, logical reasoning, and mathematical analysis. But how do we justify our confidence in these methods? Scientific success might be seen as validating scientific methods, but this argument is itself circular, using scientific reasoning to validate scientific reasoning. Moreover, the history of science reveals numerous cases where accepted methods led to false conclusions, or where revolutionary advances required abandoning previously reliable approaches. This historical perspective complicates simple appeals to scientific success as justification for scientific methods. If scientific methods can be revised or abandoned, what guarantees their current reliability? The criterion problem also challenges legal and political systems that rely on establishing facts and making rational decisions. Legal procedures for determining guilt or innocence presuppose criteria for evaluating evidence and testimony. But these criteria themselves rest on assumptions about human psychology, the reliability of memory, the interpretation of physical evidence, and numerous other factors that could be questioned. Similarly, democratic decision-making assumes that citizens can evaluate competing claims and make rational choices about policies and candidates. But if the problem of the criterion undermines our confidence in human reasoning generally, it raises questions about the epistemic foundations of democratic governance. How can we trust collective decision-making if individual reasoning is fundamentally problematic? Educational systems face related challenges in determining what knowledge to transmit and how to teach students to think critically. If teachers cannot provide ultimate justification for the methods and content they present, how should they respond to students who demand such justification? The criterion problem suggests that education might need to focus on developing intellectual virtues like curiosity, open-mindedness, and tolerance for uncertainty, rather than on transmitting supposedly certain knowledge. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to the problem of the criterion, each offering different perspectives on how to understand knowledge and justification. Coherentist approaches suggest that beliefs are justified not by foundational principles, but by how well they fit together in a coherent system. From this perspective, individual beliefs don't need independent justification as long as they contribute to an overall coherent worldview. Coherentism avoids both circularity and infinite regress by abandoning the linear model of justification entirely. Instead of requiring beliefs to be justified by other beliefs in a hierarchical structure, coherentism treats justification as a holistic property of entire belief systems. Beliefs are justified by their role in creating and maintaining coherence rather than by their relationship to basic or foundational beliefs. However, coherentism faces its own challenges. Why should coherence be considered a reliable guide to truth? False beliefs can form coherent systems just as easily as true beliefs. Moreover, competing coherent systems might exist, raising questions about how to choose between them. These problems suggest that coherentism might not fully solve the criterion problem, but rather relocate it to questions about the criteria for coherence itself. Pragmatist approaches to the criterion problem focus on the practical consequences of beliefs rather than their theoretical justification. From this perspective, beliefs are valuable not because they can be proven true, but because they work effectively in practice. Scientific theories are useful because they enable successful prediction and control. Moral principles are valuable because they promote human flourishing, and logical rules are important because they facilitate effective reasoning. Pragmatism sidesteps the traditional criterion problem by changing the subject from theoretical justification to practical effectiveness. Instead of asking whether our methods for determining truth are ultimately reliable, pragmatists ask whether our methods serve human purposes effectively. This shift makes the criterion problem less pressing, but raises new questions about how to evaluate practical effectiveness and whether practical success provides any guarantee of theoretical truth. Reliabilist epistemology offers another approach by focusing on the reliability of belief-forming processes rather than on the justification of individual beliefs. From this perspective, beliefs are warranted if they result from processes that generally produce true beliefs, regardless of whether we can justify those processes philosophically. Perception, memory, and reasoning might be considered reliable even if we cannot provide ultimate justification for trusting them. Reliabilism promises to resolve the criterion problem by grounding knowledge in objective features of our cognitive processes rather than in subjective justification. If our belief-forming mechanisms are in fact reliable, then the beliefs they produce constitute knowledge regardless of whether we can prove their reliability. This approach treats the criterion problem as a philosophical puzzle that doesn't undermine the practical reliability of human cognition. Critics of reliabilism point out that it merely pushes the criterion problem to a different level. How do we determine which processes are reliable? What criteria do we use to evaluate reliability? If we use unreliable processes to identify reliable processes, the entire approach becomes circular. These challenges suggest that reliabilism might not fully escape the criterion problem, but rather transform it into questions about the criteria for reliability. Virtue epistemology focuses on the intellectual character of believers rather than on the justification of beliefs or the reliability of processes. From this perspective, knowledge results from the exercise of intellectual virtues like curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual humility, and careful reasoning. Beliefs held by intellectually virtuous agents are more likely to constitute knowledge than beliefs held by intellectually vicious agents. This approach shifts attention from the logical structure of justification to the personal qualities that promote good thinking. Instead of seeking ultimate criteria for truth, virtue epistemologists focus on cultivating the character traits that make people better thinkers. This personal approach to the criterion problem emphasizes education and character development rather than philosophical argument. However, virtue epistemology faces questions about which character traits genuinely promote knowledge and how to identify virtuous thinkers. These questions threaten to recreate the criterion problem at the level of intellectual virtue. What criteria do we use to identify intellectual virtues, and how do we justify those criteria? The approach might succeed in making the criterion problem less central to epistemology, but it doesn't necessarily solve it completely. Modern contextualist approaches suggest that knowledge and justification are relative to particular contexts rather than absolute properties of beliefs. What counts as adequate justification in a scientific context might be different from what counts as adequate justification in a legal context or an everyday practical context. This relativity dissolves the criterion problem by denying that there must be universal criteria for knowledge. Contextualism recognizes that human knowledge-seeking activities occur within specific social and practical contexts that shape the standards for evaluation. Scientific communities develop their own criteria for evaluating theories. Legal systems establish their own standards for evaluating evidence, and everyday practical reasoning operates according to its own informal standards. The criterion problem arises only when we demand universal standards that transcend all contexts. This approach offers a pragmatic solution to the criterion problem, but raises new questions about relativism and objectivity. If standards for knowledge are context relative, does this mean that truth itself is relative? How do we evaluate competing contexts or resolve conflicts between them? Contextualism might solve some versions of the criterion problem, while creating new challenges about the nature of truth and objectivity. The problem of the criterion ultimately reveals something profound about the human condition. Our quest for knowledge and understanding operates within fundamental limitations that cannot be completely overcome through philosophical analysis. This recognition need not lead to skepticism or despair, but can inspire intellectual humility and appreciation for the remarkable achievements of human knowledge despite its uncertain foundations. The criterion problem teaches us that absolute certainty might be less important than we initially supposed. Humans have developed sophisticated knowledge and technology, created art and literature, and built complex societies without resolving the fundamental epistemological puzzles that philosophers debate. This practical success suggests that the criterion problem, while intellectually fascinating, might not undermine the possibility of knowledge and rational action. Perhaps the most important lesson of the problem of the criterion is that knowledge and reasoning are human activities that cannot be completely separated from human nature, culture, and history. Our criteria for evaluation emerge from our biological evolution, cultural development, and individual experience rather than from pure logical analysis. Recognizing this embeddedness doesn't invalidate human knowledge, but helps us understand its character and limitations more clearly. The criterion problem invites us to approach knowledge claims with appropriate humility, while remaining committed to careful reasoning and evidence evaluation. It suggests that intellectual virtues like open-mindedness, curiosity, and tolerance for uncertainty might be more important than the impossible quest for absolute certainty. In embracing these virtues, we can continue the ancient human project of understanding ourselves and our world, even without perfect logical foundations. As we leave the great library of Alexandria in our imagination, scrolls of wisdom still beckoning from endless shelves, we carry with us not the certainty we might have hoped to find, but something perhaps more valuable: a deeper appreciation for the complexity and mystery of human knowledge. The problem of the criterion reminds us that the quest for understanding is itself part of what makes us human, even when, perhaps especially when, that quest reveals the limits of human reason. The lottery coincidence. On a warm Tuesday evening in a small suburban town, Margaret Thompson stops at the corner convenience store to purchase a lottery ticket, as she has done every week for the past 15 years. The routine is familiar, selecting the same numbers that represent her children's birthdays, paying the clock, and tucking the tickets safely into her wallet. She harbors no great expectations. The odds against winning are astronomical, calculated at 1 in 300 million. But this Tuesday is different. When the numbers are announced that evening, Margaret discovers that impossible thing has happened. Her ticket matches perfectly. She has won the jackpot of $450 million. As the reality sinks in, friends and family celebrate with champagne and congratulations. Yet within days, whispers begin to circulate. Comments appear on social media. A local newspaper columnist raises eyebrows with a pointed question. What are the odds that Margaret Thompson won legitimately? This scenario embodies the lottery coincidence paradox, a puzzle that challenges our understanding of probability, suspicion, and the nature of improbable events. The paradox asks a troubling question. When something so unlikely occurs that its probability approaches zero, should we conclude that it happened naturally or that something else? Fraud, manipulation, or systematic bias? Better explains the outcome? The mathematical reality of lottery odds makes the paradox particularly acute. In a typical large lottery, any individual ticket has roughly a 1 in 300 million chance of winning. A probability so small, it defies intuitive comprehension. To put this in perspective, you're more likely to be struck by lightning while being attacked by a shark during a solar eclipse than to win such a lottery with a single ticket. When faced with such astronomical odds, our minds naturally search for alternative explanations. The paradox reveals a fundamental tension between mathematical probability and psychological reasoning. Mathematics tells us that highly improbable events, while unlikely for any specific individual, become virtually certain when millions of people participate. Someone must win the lottery. And from a statistical perspective, Margaret Thompson is just as likely as anyone else to be that someone. The improbability of her specific victory doesn't make it suspicious. It makes it normal within the broader statistical framework. Yet our psychological machinery evolved to detect patterns and anomalies that might signal danger or opportunity. When confronted with highly improbable events, we instinctively seek causal explanations beyond mere chance. This tendency serves us well in many contexts. Unusual patterns often do indicate underlying causes that merit investigation. The challenge lies in distinguishing between genuinely suspicious patterns and the natural occurrence of statistically expected but individually unlikely events. Consider how the paradox manifests in different contexts. If Margaret had won the lottery twice in the same year, our suspicions might be more justified. The probability of winning twice would be roughly 1 in 90 trillion. So unlikely that fraud or systematic error becomes a more plausible explanation than chance. But what about winning once? The paradox forces us to grapple with where we draw the line between acceptable coincidence and suspicious improbability. Real-world examples illuminate this challenge. In 1988, Evelyn Marie Adams won the New Jersey lottery twice within 4 months, earning her a place in record books and widespread suspicion. Statisticians calculated that the odds of any specific person winning twice were approximately 1 in 17 trillion. Yet mathematicians also pointed out that the odds of someone, somewhere in America, winning a state lottery twice within a year were much more reasonable. Perhaps 1 in 30, given the number of lottery players and frequency of drawings. This distinction between specific and general probability lies at the heart of the lottery coincidence paradox. The probability that Margaret Thompson specifically would win is vanishingly small, but the probability that someone would win is essentially certain. Our minds struggle to maintain this distinction, often conflating the improbability of specific outcomes with the implausibility of any unusual outcome occurring. The paradox extends beyond lotteries to challenge our reasoning about unlikely events throughout life. Consider medical diagnoses of rare diseases. When a patient presents with symptoms that match a condition affecting 1 in a million people, doctors must decide whether to pursue expensive testing or attribute the symptoms to more common causes. The rarity of the condition argues against testing, yet someone must be that 1 in a million case. Criminal investigations face similar challenges when evaluating circumstantial evidence. DNA evidence might match a suspect with odds of 1 in several billion, seemingly providing overwhelming proof of guilt. Yet, defense attorneys can argue that in a population of hundreds of millions, several people might share the same genetic markers. The lottery coincidence paradox reveals how statistical reasoning intersects with questions of justice and burden of proof. The paradox also appears in scientific research, where extremely unlikely experimental results might indicate either genuine discoveries or systematic errors. When particle physicists detect rare events that occur once in billions of collisions, they must distinguish between new phenomena and equipment malfunctions. The history of science includes both genuine discoveries that initially seemed impossibly improbable and false alarms that wasted significant resources. Financial markets provide another arena where the lottery coincidence paradox plays out daily. Investment managers who achieve extraordinary returns might be genuinely skilled or simply lucky. With thousands of fund managers making investment decisions, some will inevitably achieve remarkable success purely by chance. Distinguishing skill from luck becomes crucial for investors seeking to identify managers likely to continue their success. The rise of big data and algorithmic analysis has made the lottery coincidence paradox more relevant than ever. When computers analyze vast datasets containing millions of variables, they inevitably discover correlations that seem statistically significant but arise from pure chance. Data mining can reveal spurious patterns that appear meaningful, but reflect nothing more than the mathematical certainty that unusual combinations will emerge from large datasets. Social media amplifies the paradox by making unlikely events more visible and memorable. When someone posts about an amazing coincidence, running into their childhood friend in a foreign country, or discovering their Uber driver shares their birthday. These stories spread widely precisely because they seem so improbable. Yet with billions of people having millions of daily interactions, extraordinary coincidences become statistically inevitable rather than genuinely miraculous. The psychology underlying our response to unlikely events reveals deep features of human cognition. Our pattern-seeking minds evolved in environments where unusual events often signaled important information about threats or opportunities. A rustling bush that might indicate a predator, an unusual animal behavior that might predict weather changes, or an unexpected absence of familiar sounds that might suggest danger. These patterns provided survival advantages that shaped our cognitive architecture. This evolutionary heritage creates what psychologists call the conjunction fallacy, our tendency to perceive specific combinations of events as more probable than they actually are when those combinations fit meaningful narratives. We find it easier to believe that Margaret Thompson won the lottery because she deserved it after years of faithful participation than to accept that pure randomness selected her from millions of equally deserving players. The availability heuristic compounds this effect by making unlikely but memorable events seem more probable than they actually are. Stories about lottery fraud receive extensive media coverage precisely because they're unusual, creating the false impression that fraudulent wins are more common than legitimate ones. Our judgment becomes skewed by the disproportionate attention paid to suspicious cases relative to ordinary wins. Confirmation bias further distorts our reasoning about unlikely events. Once we develop suspicions about a particular outcome, we unconsciously seek evidence that supports those suspicions while dismissing contradictory information. If Margaret Thompson had any connection to lottery officials, no matter how tenuous, this association might seem suspicious, even though millions of people have some indirect connection to state employees. The lottery coincidence paradox also reveals cultural differences in attitudes toward probability and causation. Western scientific thinking emphasizes mechanistic causation and statistical reasoning, making pure randomness an acceptable explanation for unusual events. Other cultural traditions might emphasize fate, karma, or divine intervention as explanations for extraordinary outcomes. These different frameworks lead to varying levels of suspicion about improbable events. Legal systems must grapple with the lottery coincidence paradox when evaluating statistical evidence in court cases. Expert witnesses might testify that certain evidence patterns occur with probability less than 1 in a billion, seemingly providing overwhelming proof of guilt or innocence. Yet courts must consider whether such statistical arguments genuinely prove causation or merely demonstrate that unlikely events sometimes occur. The prosecutor's fallacy illustrates one common error in applying statistical reasoning to legal contexts. This fallacy involves confusing the probability of evidence given innocence with the probability of innocence given evidence. Even if certain evidence would be extremely unlikely if a defendant were innocent, this doesn't necessarily mean the defendant is probably guilty, especially if the prior probability of guilt is very low. Defense attorneys can exploit the lottery coincidence paradox by arguing that their clients are simply unlucky victims of circumstance. If DNA evidence, witness testimony, and physical evidence all point toward guilt, but each piece of evidence individually could occur by chance, the defense might argue that their client represents an extremely unlucky but innocent person who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The pharmaceutical industry faces lottery coincidence challenges when evaluating drug safety and efficacy. Clinical trials might reveal apparent correlations between treatments and outcomes, but distinguishing genuine causal relationships from statistical flukes requires careful analysis. The more endpoints researchers examine, the more likely they are to find spurious correlations that suggest non-existent effects. Regulatory agencies must balance the costs of falsely approving dangerous drugs against the costs of falsely rejecting beneficial ones. The lottery coincidence paradox complicates this balance by making it difficult to determine when unusual trial results reflect genuine effects versus statistical noise. Multiple testing procedures and replication requirements help address these challenges, but they cannot eliminate the fundamental uncertainty. Educational contexts provide another area where the lottery coincidence paradox influences reasoning. When students achieve unexpected test scores, either remarkably high or surprisingly low, educators must decide whether these results reflect genuine ability changes or statistical fluctuations. Standardized testing programs face similar challenges when identifying schools with unusually good or bad performance. The paradox has implications for artificial intelligence systems that must reason about probability and causation. Machine learning algorithms trained on historical data might identify patterns that reflect past coincidences rather than genuine predictive relationships. Distinguishing signal from noise becomes crucial for developing AI systems that make reliable predictions about future events. As AI systems become more sophisticated and process larger datasets, they will inevitably encounter lottery coincidence scenarios where extremely unlikely patterns emerge from the data. Programming these systems to respond appropriately to such patterns requires encoding sophisticated understanding of probability, causation, and the distinction between mathematical possibility and practical plausibility. The rise of automated decision-making systems makes the lottery coincidence paradox practically relevant for millions of people. Credit scoring algorithms, hiring software, and criminal justice risk assessment tools all make decisions based on statistical correlations that might reflect genuine patterns or mere coincidence. Understanding the paradox becomes essential for designing fair and effective automated systems. Contemporary debates about algorithmic bias often involve lottery coincidence reasoning. When automated systems produce discriminatory outcomes, determining whether these results reflect biased training data, flawed algorithms, or statistical coincidence requires sophisticated analysis. The paradox reminds us that unusual patterns in algorithmic outputs don't necessarily indicate intentional bias, though they shouldn't be dismissed without investigation. The lottery coincidence paradox ultimately teaches us humility about our ability to distinguish between chance and causation. While extremely unlikely events deserve scrutiny, they don't automatically warrant suspicion. The mathematical inevitability of improbable occurrences means that someone, somewhere, will always be experiencing events so unlikely they seem impossible. This recognition doesn't mean we should abandon critical thinking about unusual events, but rather that we should apply such thinking more carefully. The paradox suggests several principles for reasoning about improbable occurrences. Consider both specific and general probabilities. Account for selection effects and multiple comparisons. Remain aware of cognitive biases that distort probability judgments, and seek additional evidence before drawing strong conclusions from isolated, unlikely events. The paradox also highlights the importance of statistical literacy in modern society. As data becomes more abundant and analytical tools more powerful, citizens increasingly encounter claims based on statistical reasoning. Understanding the lottery coincidence paradox helps people evaluate such claims more thoughtfully, distinguishing between genuine discoveries and statistical artifacts. Perhaps most importantly, the lottery coincidence paradox reminds us that living in a probabilistic universe means accepting uncertainty and embracing nuance. Perfect knowledge about causation remains elusive, and distinguishing chance from design requires ongoing vigilance rather than simple formulas. The paradox doesn't provide easy answers, but rather frameworks for thinking more clearly about the complex relationship between probability and reality. As Margaret Thompson navigates her newfound wealth and the accompanying scrutiny, she embodies the human experience of living within probability's strange landscape. Her genuine surprise at winning, Her decision to continue working despite her windfall, and her gracious response to skeptics all suggest someone who understands that extraordinary events sometimes happen to ordinary people for no reason beyond the mathematical certainty that someone, somewhere, will always beat impossible odds. The lottery coincidence paradox invites us to marvel at the universe's capacity for surprise, while maintaining healthy skepticism about our ability to fully comprehend the dance between chance and necessity. In embracing this complexity, we develop more sophisticated appreciation for the remarkable improbability of existence itself, and the equally remarkable fact that we're here to contemplate it. The Sorcerer's Apprentice Syndrome. In the shadowy depths of an ancient tower laboratory, candlelight flickers across walls lined with dusty tomes and bubbling alchemical apparatus. A young apprentice, weary from hours of tedious chores, watches his master's powerful magic with a mixture of awe and envy. The sorcerer departs on urgent business, leaving behind only stern warnings about touching his enchanted implements. But temptation proves stronger than wisdom, and the apprentice reaches for a seemingly simple broom, whispering the magical words he has memorized from careful observation. The broom springs to life with startling vigor, immediately beginning to carry water from the well to fill the laboratory's basins. The apprentice watches with delight as his magical servant performs the mundane task he had dreaded. But as minutes pass, delight transforms into concern, then alarm, then terror. The broom continues its work with mechanical persistence, bringing bucket after bucket of water, even as the basin's overflow and flood spreads across the stone floor. Frantically, the apprentice tries to stop his creation, but he lacks the knowledge to reverse the spell. In desperation, he grabs an axe and splits the broom in half, only to watch in horror as both pieces continue working, now doubled in their destructive efficiency. Water rises around his ankles, then his knees, as the enchanted servants pursue their task with mindless determination, oblivious to the chaos they create. This tale, immortalized in Disney's Fantasia and countless retellings, serves as a perfect metaphor for what modern thinkers call the Sorcerer's Apprentice Syndrome. The phenomenon whereby human creations, once set in motion, develop their own momentum and escape the control of their creators. The syndrome captures a fundamental aspect of human innovation: our remarkable ability to create systems more powerful than ourselves, combined with our frequent inability to predict or control their long-term consequences. The Industrial Revolution provides the most dramatic historical example of the Sorcerer's Apprentice Syndrome. When inventors began harnessing steam power and mechanizing production, they intended to reduce human labor and increase prosperity. The transformation succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, creating unprecedented wealth and technological capability. Yet it also unleashed consequences they never anticipated: environmental degradation, urban overcrowding, labor exploitation, and social upheaval that continue to shape our world today. The factory system, like the apprentice's broom, began as a tool to serve human purposes, but gradually developed its own logic and momentum. Competitive pressures forced businesses to prioritize efficiency and profit maximization, often at the expense of worker welfare or environmental protection. The system's internal logic, the imperative to reduce costs and increase output, became a force that shaped human behavior rather than merely responding to human direction. Consider how the automobile transformed society in ways its inventors never intended. Henry Ford envisioned cars as tools to increase individual mobility and freedom. He could hardly have predicted that widespread automobile adoption would reshape urban planning, create suburban sprawl, contribute to climate change, and generate entire industries devoted to insurance, regulation, and accident response. The automobile became not just a tool we use, but a technology that fundamentally altered how we organize space, time, and social relationships. The digital revolution exemplifies the syndrome in even more dramatic fashion. Computer networks began as tools for researchers to share information and resources. The internet emerged from military research into distributed communication systems that could survive nuclear attack. Social media platforms started as ways for friends to stay connected. Yet these technologies have evolved into complex systems that influence political processes, reshape human psychology, and challenge traditional notions of privacy, truth, and social cohesion in ways their creators never anticipated. Facebook provides a particularly striking example. Mark Zuckerberg initially created the platform to help college students connect with each other. A digital version of the printed directories that helped students learn about their classmates. The simple concept of allowing people to share updates and photos with friends has evolved into a global information ecosystem that influences elections, spreads misinformation, affects mental health, and challenges the authority of traditional institutions. The platform's algorithms, designed to maximize user engagement by showing content likely to generate responses, have inadvertently promoted divisive and emotionally charged material. Like The Apprentice's broom, these algorithms pursue their programmed objective, increasing engagement, without understanding or caring about broader consequences for social cohesion or individual well-being. Artificial intelligence represents perhaps the most dramatic contemporary example of the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome. Machine learning systems, trained to optimize specific objectives, sometimes develop strategies that technically achieve their goals while violating the spirit of what their creators intended. AI systems designed to play games have discovered exploits that win by manipulating the game environment rather than playing as intended. Recommendation algorithms designed to keep users engaged have learned to exploit psychological vulnerabilities in ways that their creators find ethically troubling. The challenge becomes even more acute as AI systems become more powerful and autonomous. Deep learning systems make decisions through processes so complex that even their creators cannot fully understand or predict their behavior. These systems are beginning to exhibit emergent properties, capabilities that arise from their training but were not explicitly programmed. We are creating digital apprentices that might someday face the same problem as their mythical predecessor: insufficient knowledge to control the forces they have unleashed. Financial markets provide another arena where the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome manifests dramatically. Algorithmic trading systems, designed to execute trades faster and more efficiently than human traders, now dominate global financial markets. These systems can process information and execute trades in microseconds, operating at speeds that make human oversight practically impossible. The flash crash of 2010 illustrated the potential dangers of this technological apprenticeship. Automated trading systems, responding to market conditions and each other's behavior, created a feedback loop that temporarily erased nearly $1 trillion in market value within minutes. Like the apprentice watching his magical broom spiral out of control, human traders could only observe as their automated systems generated chaos far beyond what any individual algorithm was programmed to do. Climate change represents perhaps the most consequential example of the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome in human history. The Industrial Revolution unleashed the power of fossil fuels to transform human civilization, creating unprecedented prosperity and technological capability. Yet this same transformation set in motion atmospheric changes that now threaten the stability of Earth's climate system. The carbon cycle, once a self-regulating system that maintained atmospheric balance over geological timescales, has been disrupted by human activity in ways that create positive feedback loops. Melting Arctic ice reduces the planet's ability to reflect solar radiation, accelerating warming. Thawing permafrost releases methane and carbon dioxide, further accelerating warming. Rising temperatures increase water vapor in the atmosphere, which traps additional heat. Like the apprentice's multiplying brooms, these feedback mechanisms pursue their own logic regardless of human intentions or desires. The syndrome appears throughout the history of technology and social innovation. Nuclear weapons, developed to end World War II and provide national security, created new forms of existential risk that continue to threaten human civilization. Antibiotics, discovered to treat bacterial infections, have led to the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that pose new health challenges. Pesticides, designed to protect crops, have contributed to pollinator decline and ecosystem disruption. Urban planning provides subtler but equally important examples. Highway systems, built to improve transportation, often divided communities and contributed to urban decay. Urban renewal projects, intended to improve living conditions, sometimes destroyed established communities and social networks. Public housing projects, designed to provide affordable homes, sometimes concentrated poverty and created new social problems. The syndrome extends beyond technology to encompass social and political innovations. Democracy, designed to give people control over their governments, can sometimes be manipulated by demagogues or captured by special interests. Market economies, intended to efficiently allocate resources and promote innovation, can generate inequality and instability that threaten social cohesion. Educational systems, created to transmit knowledge and develop human potential, sometimes become bureaucratic institutions that stifle creativity and critical thinking. Understanding the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome requires recognizing several key characteristics that make human creations prone to escaping control. Complex systems often exhibit emergent properties that cannot be predicted from understanding their individual components. When many simple elements interact according to basic rules, the resulting system behavior can be surprisingly complex and difficult to predict or control. Feedback loops amplify small changes in ways that can lead to dramatic system-wide effects. Positive feedback loops, where effects reinforce their causes, can drive systems far from their initial state. Negative feedback loops, where effects counteract their causes, can create stability, but also resistance to desired changes. Understanding and managing these feedback dynamics requires sophisticated analysis that often exceeds human cognitive capabilities. Unintended consequences arise from the gap between human intentions and system behavior. Designers focus on intended functions while remaining blind to potential side effects. Complex systems interact with their environments in ways that generate unexpected emergent properties. The law of unintended consequences suggests that purposeful action often produces outcomes that differ from intended results, sometimes dramatically so. Scale effects mean that systems behave differently at different sizes. Technologies that work well in small-scale applications can create problems when scaled up to serve millions or billions of users. Social innovations that succeed in particular communities might fail or cause harm when implemented more broadly. The transition from small to large scale often reveals new properties and challenges that weren't apparent during initial development. Prevention and mitigation of the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome requires developing more sophisticated approaches to innovation and system design. Precautionary principles suggest carefully evaluating potential risks before deploying new technologies, especially those with global or irreversible effects. Adaptive management involves designing systems that can be modified or terminated if they produce harmful consequences. Robust governance mechanisms help ensure that human values and priorities guide technological development rather than being overwhelmed by technical imperatives. Democratic oversight, ethical review processes, and participatory design approaches can help align technological capabilities with human flourishing. International cooperation becomes essential when dealing with technologies that transcend national boundaries. Education and cultural change play crucial roles in developing collective wisdom about technological choices. Technical literacy helps citizens understand and evaluate technological proposals. Historical awareness helps people learn from past examples of uncontrolled technological change. Ethical reflection helps societies clarify their values and priorities before making irreversible technological commitments. The Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome doesn't argue for abandoning innovation or technological development. Human creativity and problem-solving capabilities have generated remarkable improvements in health, prosperity, and quality of life. Technology has solved countless problems and opened new possibilities for human flourishing. The challenge lies not in avoiding innovation, but in developing more wisdom about how to guide it. The syndrome does suggest the importance of humility and caution in approaching complex systems. The apprentice's mistake wasn't using magic, but failing to understand the forces he was unleashing. Similarly, human societies must develop better methods for understanding and controlling the systems we create, rather than simply hoping that good intentions will produce good outcomes. Contemporary challenges like artificial intelligence governance, climate change mitigation, and biotechnology regulation will test our ability to learn from the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome. These technologies offer tremendous potential benefits, but also pose risks that could exceed our ability to manage them if we proceed without adequate wisdom and preparation. The syndrome ultimately reminds us that power without wisdom is dangerous, whether wielded by fictional apprentices or real societies. The magical broom's mindless persistence mirrors the way complex systems can pursue their programmed objectives without regard for broader consequences. Preventing such scenarios requires not just technical competence, but also the wisdom to understand when and how to intervene in the systems we create. As we stand at the threshold of even more powerful technologies, artificial general intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and others, the lessons of the Sorcerer's Apprentice become more urgent than ever. The apprentice eventually learned to control his creation through greater understanding and more careful practice. Humanity faces the same challenge, developing the wisdom to guide our increasingly powerful tools toward outcomes that serve human flourishing rather than undermining it. The Tower Laboratory where our story began still stands in imagination, its stone walls bearing witness to both the perils and promises of human creativity. The broom rests quietly now, its magical energies dormant but ready to spring into action at the proper word. The choice of when and how to speak that word, and more importantly, how to retain control once we do, remains one of the most crucial challenges facing human civilization. In meeting this challenge successfully, we honor both of the apprentice's creativity and his hard-won wisdom about the responsibilities that come with power. The paradox of the heap. Picture yourself standing before a massive pile of golden sand, perhaps 10,000 grains high, stretching several feet across your vision. By any reasonable definition, this formation clearly constitutes a heap, a substantial accumulation of granular material that rises prominently from the ground around it. No one would hesitate to call this collection of sand a heap, just as no one would argue that a single grain of sand, lying isolated on an otherwise empty surface, forms a heap by itself. But now imagine beginning a peculiar experiment. You carefully remove one grain of sand from the massive pile before you. Surely this single grain's absence doesn't transform your heap into a non-heap. The pile remains essentially unchanged. Still thousands of grains high, still clearly recognizable as a substantial accumulation. So you remove another grain, then another, each time asking the same question: do I still have a heap? This seemingly innocent procedure sets in motion one of philosophy's most enduring and troubling paradoxes. Known as the Sorites paradox, from the Greek word soros, meaning heap, this puzzle reveals fundamental problems with how we think about categories, boundaries, and the nature of vague concepts that pervade everyday language and reasoning. The logical structure of the paradox appears unassailable. If 10,000 grains constitute a heap, and removing one grain cannot transform a heap into a non-heap, then 9,999 grains must also constitute a heap. By the same reasoning, 9,998 grains constitute a heap, as do 9,997 grains, and so forth. Following this logic to its inevitable conclusion, we must accept that even a single grain of sand constitutes a heap, a conclusion that violates our basic understanding of what the word heap means. Yet, the alternative seems equally problematic. If we insist that at some point in our grain-by-grain removal process, we cross a boundary from heap to non-heap, we must identify a specific number of grains that marks this transition. Does a pile cease to be a heap when it contains exactly 1,000 grains? 500? 100? Any such precise boundary seems arbitrary and counterintuitive. How could the removal of a single grain, the difference between, say, 500 and 499 grains, mark the precise moment when a heap becomes a non-heap? The Sorites paradox reveals the pervasive presence of vague concepts in human language and thought. Most of the categories we use to organize our experience, tall, red, bald, rich, old, beautiful, lack precise boundaries. When does someone transition from tall to not tall? At exactly what wavelength does orange become red? How many hairs must a person lose before they become bald? These questions seem to demand precision that the concepts themselves don't possess. Vagueness appears to be a fundamental feature of natural language, rather than a mere imperfection that could be eliminated through greater care or precision. We describe people as tall or short without specifying exact height measurements, discuss objects as red or blue without providing precise wavelength specifications, and classify weather as hot or cold without consulting thermometers. This vagueness enables flexible and efficient communication about a world that rarely presents us with sharp categorical boundaries. Consider how the paradox manifests in biological classification. When did the evolutionary ancestors of modern humans become human? Evolutionary biology reveals a continuous process of gradual change over millions of years, with no sharp boundary marking the transition from pre-human to human. Yet we confidently classify ourselves as human and distinguish ourselves from other species. The Sorites paradox suggests that either there was no first human, because each generation was essentially the same as its parents, or there was an arbitrary moment when humanity suddenly emerged, which contradicts our understanding of gradual evolutionary change. The paradox creates similar puzzles throughout scientific classification. When does a star become a planet? When does a hill become a mountain? When does a pond become a lake? Scientific attempts to establish precise criteria for these categories often seem arbitrary and fail to capture the intuitive boundaries that inform everyday usage. The International Astronomical Union's definition of a planet, established to resolve questions about Pluto's status, illustrates both the need for precise scientific categories and the inevitable artificiality of drawing sharp boundaries through continuous phenomena. Medical diagnosis provides another arena where the Sorites paradox creates practical challenges. When does elevated blood pressure become hypertension? When does occasional forgetfulness become dementia? When does sadness become depression? Medical practitioners must make categorical diagnoses, deciding whether patients have specific conditions that qualify them for particular treatments. Yet many medical conditions exist along continuous spectra that resist sharp categorization. The development of diagnostic criteria represents an attempt to impose precision on inherently vague phenomena. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders specifies exact numbers of symptoms required for various psychological conditions, creating apparent precision where the underlying reality might be more gradual and continuous. These criteria serve important practical purposes, enabling consistent diagnosis and treatment decisions, but they also illustrate the tension between categorical thinking and continuous variation. Legal systems face similar challenges when applying categorical rules to situations that involve continuous variation. Criminal law distinguishes between legal and illegal behavior, often specifying precise thresholds that determine whether actions constitute crimes. Speed limits define exact boundaries between legal and illegal driving speeds, even though the danger posed by exceeding these limits increases gradually, rather than jumping discontinuously at the specified threshold. The Sorites paradox illuminates the inherent arbitrariness of many legal boundaries while acknowledging their practical necessity. Legal systems require precise rules to ensure consistent application and fair treatment, yet the phenomena they regulate often involve gradual transitions rather than sharp boundaries. This tension between legal precision and empirical vagueness creates ongoing challenges for lawmaking and judicial interpretation. Philosophers have proposed various solutions to the Sorites paradox, each offering different insights into the nature of vagueness and categorical thinking. Classical logic, which requires every proposition to be either true or false, struggles with vague concepts that seem to resist such binary classification. If X is a heap must be either true or false for any specific pile X, then there must be a precise boundary between heaps and non-heaps, regardless of whether we can identify that boundary. Fuzzy logic offers an alternative approach by allowing propositions to have degrees of truth between completely true and completely false. In fuzzy logic, a pile of 1,000 grains might be mostly true, that it's a heap, while a pile of 100 grains might be somewhat true, that it's a heap. This approach captures the intuitive idea that some piles are more heap-like than others, avoiding the forced precision that creates the classical paradox. However, fuzzy logic faces its own version of the Sorites paradox. If removing one grain from a pile can only change its degree of heapness by an infinitesimal amount, then we still face the question of how gradual changes can accumulate into significant categorical differences. The fuzzy approach might postpone the paradox rather than resolving it completely. Supervaluationist approaches propose that vague statements are true, when they're true under all reasonable ways of making the concepts precise. A statement like 1,000 grains constitute a heap would be true because any reasonable way of specifying the minimum number of grains required for a heap would include 1,000 grains. Conversely, 5 grains constitute a heap would be false because no reasonable specification would count 5 grains as a heap. This approach preserves classical logic while acknowledging vagueness, but it requires judgments about which specifications are reasonable, judgments that might themselves be vague. The supervaluationist solution also implies that there are cases where statements are neither true nor false, challenging the classical principle that every proposition must have exactly one truth value. Epistemicist approaches argue that vague concepts do have precise boundaries, but we simply cannot know where those boundaries lie. According to this view, there is a precise number of grains that constitutes the minimum for a heap, but this fact is unknowable due to the limitations of human knowledge and language. The appearance of vagueness results from our ignorance rather than from genuine indeterminacy in the world. Epistemicism preserves classical logic and the idea that the world has precise boundaries, but it seems to conflict with our intuitions about how vague concepts work. If heap has a precise meaning that determines exact boundaries, why do competent speakers of the language disagree about borderline cases? The epistemicist must argue that all but one of these speakers are mistaken about the meaning of their own language. A counterintuitive conclusion. Contextualist approaches suggest that the truth conditions for vague statements depend on conversational context. What counts as a heap in one context might not count as a heap in another context, depending on the purposes and standards relevant to the particular conversation. This approach explains why the same pile might be described as a heap in some situations, but not others, without requiring that the pile itself has changed. Contextualism captures important insights about how vague language actually works in practice, but it faces questions about whether context can fully resolve the Sorites paradox. Even within specific contexts, we might still face questions about precise boundaries that reproduce the original paradox at a more fine-grained level. The Sorites paradox has important implications for artificial intelligence and computer science, where systems must often make categorical decisions about continuous phenomena. Machine learning algorithms typically require precise classifications, determining whether emails are spam or not spam, whether images contain cats or not cats, whether loan applications should be approved or denied. Yet the phenomena these systems analyze often involve gradual transitions that resist sharp categorization. Natural language processing systems face particular challenges with vague concepts. When humans describe something as somewhat red or quite tall, they're using vague language that conveys meaningful information despite its imprecision. Teaching artificial systems to understand and generate such language requires grappling with the same puzzles about vagueness that philosophers have debated for centuries. The paradox also illuminates challenges in democratic decision-making and public policy. Political concepts like justice, freedom, equality, and prosperity are inherently vague. Yet democratic societies must make specific policy decisions that operationalize these concepts. Debates about taxation, regulation, and social programs often involve attempts to translate vague values into precise rules, a process that inevitably involves arbitrary boundary drawing. Consider debates about poverty thresholds, minimum wage levels, or environmental regulations. These policies require specifying exact numerical criteria that determine eligibility for benefits, legal compliance, or regulatory requirements. Yet the underlying phenomena, economic hardship, living wages, environmental protection, involve continuous variation that resists sharp categorization. The Sorites paradox reveals why such policy debates often seem to involve arbitrary line drawing that satisfies no one completely. Educational assessment provides another domain where the paradox creates practical challenges. Grading systems require categorical judgments, determining whether student performance merits an A, B, C, D, or F. Yet student learning and ability exist along continuous dimensions that don't naturally divide into discrete categories. The precise boundaries between grade levels are necessarily arbitrary, yet they carry significant consequences for students' educational and career opportunities. Standardized testing attempts to provide objective measures of student achievement, but the Sorites paradox suggests that any specific cutoff scores for categories like proficient or advanced involve arbitrary boundary drawing. The apparent precision of numerical scores might mask the inherent vagueness of the underlying concepts being measured. The paradox raises profound questions about the nature of reality itself. Does the world contain genuine vagueness, or does vagueness exist only in our language and concepts? If reality has precise boundaries that we simply cannot perceive or specify, then vagueness might be purely epistemic, a limitation of human knowledge rather than a feature of the world. Alternatively, if the world itself contains genuine indeterminacy, then vagueness might be metaphysical, a fundamental feature of reality that our language accurately reflects. Quantum mechanics adds complexity to this question by suggesting that the physical world might contain genuine indeterminacy at the microscopic level. If quantum phenomena are truly random rather than merely unpredictable, then reality itself might be vague in ways that parallel the vagueness of everyday concepts. This connection between logical and physical indeterminacy remains an active area of philosophical and scientific investigation. The temporal dimension of the Sorites paradox creates additional puzzles about change and persistence over time. When does a child become an adult? When does a young person become middle-aged? When does someone become elderly? These transitions involve gradual changes that resist sharp temporal boundaries, yet we routinely make age-based distinctions for legal, social, and practical purposes. Personal identity itself might be subject to Sorites-like puzzles. If our bodies and minds change gradually over time, at what point, if any, do we become different people? The paradox suggests that either personal identity is perfectly continuous, in which case we remain the same person throughout our lives despite dramatic changes, or it involves arbitrary boundaries, in which case we become different people at specific moments that seem to lack special significance. The Sorites paradox ultimately teaches us humility about the precision of human concepts and the complexity of applying categorical thinking to a world of continuous variation. The paradox doesn't necessarily undermine the usefulness of vague concepts, but it does reveal the limitations and challenges involved in precise reasoning about imprecise phenomena. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Sorites paradox is that precision and vagueness serve different but complementary functions in human thought and communication. Vague concepts enable flexible communication about complex phenomena that resist sharp categorization. Precise concepts enable rigorous reasoning and consistent decision-making. The challenge lies not in eliminating vagueness, but in understanding when precision is necessary, and when vagueness serves our purposes better. The paradox also reminds us that the boundaries we draw, whether in science, law, medicine, or everyday life, often involve pragmatic decisions rather than discoveries of natural divisions in the world. These boundaries serve important practical functions, but we should approach them with appropriate humility about their artificial nature and potential limitations. As we conclude our contemplation of the heap of sand, now reduced perhaps to just a few scattered grains, we might reflect on how this simple image has opened doorways into fundamental questions about language, thought, and reality. The Sorites paradox reveals that even our most basic concepts contain depths of complexity that resist easy resolution. In embracing this complexity, rather than demanding false precision, we develop more sophisticated appreciation for the remarkable achievements of human communication and reasoning, despite, or perhaps because of, their inherent limitations. The sand grains rest quietly now, neither clearly constituting a heap, nor clearly failing to do so. In their ambiguous state, they embody the profound truth that reality often resists the clean categories we try to impose upon it. This resistance is not a failure of human thought, but rather an invitation to think more carefully about the tools we use to understand our world and ourselves. The infinite regress of reasons. In the marble halls of ancient Athens, where Socrates once challenged his fellow citizens with relentless questioning, imagine a scene that captures the essence of human inquiry at its most persistent. A student approaches his teacher with what seems like a simple question about justice. The teacher provides a thoughtful answer, explaining that justice involves giving each person their due. But the student, inspired by Socratic method, presses further. Why should we give each person their due? The teacher responds with another principle, which prompts another why, then another, and another, creating an endless chain of questioning that reveals something profound and troubling about the nature of human reasoning. This scenario illustrates the infinite regress of reasons, a philosophical puzzle that challenges our confidence in rational justification itself. The problem is elegant in its simplicity, yet devastating in its implications. Every reason we give for believing something seems to require another reason, which requires another reason, and so on without end. If we demand justification for every belief, we embark on a journey that appears to have no final destination. The regress problem emerges whenever we ask the most basic question that drives all philosophical inquiry. Why should I believe that? This question seems perfectly reasonable. After all, we want our beliefs to be based on good reasons, rather than mere prejudice, tradition, or wishful thinking. But the demand for reasons, when pursued consistently, leads to a logical structure that never reaches a secure foundation. Consider a concrete example of how the regress unfolds. Someone claims that democracy is the best form of government. When asked why, they might respond that democracy gives people control over the decisions that affect their lives. But why is it good for people to have such control? Because people have a right to self-determination. But why do people have this right? Because all humans possess inherent dignity that demands respect for their autonomy. But why should we believe that humans possess such dignity? Because at each step, the justification seems reasonable, yet each answer generates a new question that demands its own justification. The chain of reasoning stretches backward indefinitely, never reaching a principle so fundamental that it requires no further support. This creates a profound puzzle about the nature of rational belief. If every belief requires justification, and every justification requires further justification, how can we ever achieve genuine knowledge or rational confidence in our beliefs? The infinite regress reveals itself, not just in abstract philosophical arguments, but in many domains of human reasoning. Scientific explanation faces similar challenges when we ask increasingly fundamental questions about natural phenomena. Why do objects fall toward Earth? Because of gravitational attraction. Why does gravitational attraction exist? Because mass curves spacetime. Why does mass curve spacetime? Because that's how the universe works according to Einstein's field equations. But why do these equations describe reality? Why does the universe operate according to mathematical principles at all? Each scientific answer raises new questions that probe deeper into the foundations of natural order. While science has been remarkably successful at providing explanations for natural phenomena, the regress problem suggests that even our best scientific theories rest ultimately on assumptions that cannot themselves be scientifically justified without circularity. Mathematics, often considered the most certain of human knowledge, faces its own version of the infinite regress. Mathematical proofs depend on axioms, basic principles that are accepted without proof within the mathematical system. But why should we accept these particular axioms rather than others? If we try to justify mathematical axioms, we must appeal to even more basic principles, which themselves require justification. The regress threatens to undermine even mathematical certainty. The problem becomes particularly acute when we consider the foundations of logic itself. We use logical reasoning to evaluate arguments and justify beliefs, but how do we justify our confidence in logical reasoning? Any attempt to prove that logic is reliable must use logical reasoning, creating a circular argument that seems to undermine the entire enterprise. If we cannot justify logic without using logic, how can we be confident that logical reasoning leads to truth? Different philosophical traditions have developed various strategies for addressing the infinite regress of reasons, each revealing different aspects of the problem while raising new questions. The foundationalist approach attempts to stop the regress by identifying basic beliefs that don't require further justification. These foundational beliefs are supposed to be self-evident, incorrigible, or otherwise epistemically privileged in ways that make them suitable as starting points for all other knowledge. Classical foundationalists like René Descartes sought indubitable beliefs that could serve as the foundation for all knowledge. Descartes famously identified, "I think, therefore I am," as a belief that could not be doubted without contradiction, since the very act of doubting presupposes the existence of a thinking subject. From this foundation, Descartes has attempted to build up the entire edifice of human knowledge through careful deductive reasoning. However, foundationalism faces significant challenges. Critics argue that no beliefs are truly self-evident or indubitable. Even seemingly basic beliefs about our immediate experience or logical principles can be questioned in various ways. Moreover, the connection between foundational beliefs and the vast superstructure of knowledge we want to justify often seems tenuous. How do we get from "I think, therefore I am" to beliefs about the external world, other minds, scientific theories, or moral principles? Empirical foundationalists attempt to ground knowledge in immediate sensory experience, arguing that beliefs about our current sensations are incorrigible and can serve as foundations for all empirical knowledge. But this approach faces the problem of explaining how we can justify beliefs about an external world based solely on private sensory experiences. If foundational beliefs are limited to immediate experience, much of what we ordinarily consider knowledge seems to become unjustifiable. Coherentist approaches to the regress problem abandon the search for foundational beliefs and instead argue that beliefs are justified by their relationships to other beliefs within a coherent system. Rather than requiring beliefs to be supported by more basic beliefs in a hierarchical structure, coherentism treats justification as a matter of how well beliefs fit together in a web of mutual support. From a coherentist perspective, individual beliefs don't need independent foundations, because they support each other within the overall system. The justification for any particular belief comes from its role in maintaining the coherence of the entire web of beliefs. This approach avoids the regress problem by rejecting the linear model of justification that creates the need for ultimate foundations. However, coherentism faces its own challenges. Why should coherence be considered a guide to truth? Coherent systems of false beliefs are certainly possible. Indeed, conspiracy theories and elaborate fictions often display remarkable internal coherence while being completely divorced from reality. Moreover, competing coherent systems might exist, raising questions about how to choose between them. The coherentist also faces a dilemma about the scope of the belief system that provides justification. If the system is too narrow, it might not provide sufficient justification for particular beliefs. If it's too broad, it might become so inclusive that almost any belief could be justified by finding some coherent subsystem that supports it. Determining the appropriate scope for coherentist justification requires criteria that themselves need justification. Infinitist approaches embrace the infinite regress rather than trying to stop it, arguing that infinite chains of justification are possible and that the failure to complete such chains doesn't undermine knowledge or rational belief. According to infinitism, beliefs can be justified by infinite series of reasons, where each reason is supported by further reasons without end. This approach seems to solve the regress problem by accepting that justification chains are infinite and arguing that this creates no logical contradiction. As long as each step in the chain provides some support for the next, the overall structure can provide justification, even without reaching a foundation. The infinitist argues that finite minds can grasp enough of the justification chain to warrant confidence in their beliefs. Critics of infinitism question whether infinite justification chains are psychologically possible for finite minds, or whether they provide adequate guidance for practical reasoning. If we can never complete the justification for any belief, how do we decide which beliefs to accept or reject? Moreover, the infinitist still needs to explain what makes some infinite chains better than others, which seems to require additional criteria that face their own justification problems. Pragmatist approaches to the regress problem suggest that the traditional quest for ultimate justification is misguided because it misunderstands the purpose of human reasoning. Rather than seeking theoretical certainty, pragmatists argue that we should focus on the practical consequences of our beliefs and reasoning methods. From this perspective, beliefs and reasoning methods are justified by their success in helping us navigate the world effectively. Charles Sanders Peirce, one of the founders of pragmatism, argued that the ultimate test of beliefs is their ability to survive ongoing inquiry and criticism. Beliefs that continue to prove useful in prediction and action, and that withstand critical examination over time, deserve our confidence regardless of whether they can be given ultimate theoretical justification. This approach sidesteps the regress problem by changing the criteria for acceptable belief from theoretical certainty to practical effectiveness. John Dewey extended pragmatist thinking by arguing that inquiry is a form of problem-solving activity that aims to resolve doubt and uncertainty rather than to achieve absolute certainty. From this perspective, justification is always relative to particular contexts and purposes rather than being an absolute property of beliefs. The regress problem dissolves because we no longer demand ultimate justification that transcends all particular contexts. However, pragmatism faces questions about how to evaluate practical success and whether practical effectiveness provides any guarantee of truth. Beliefs might work well in the short term while being fundamentally mistaken about the nature of reality. Moreover, different practices might be successful for different purposes, raising questions about how to evaluate competing pragmatic claims. Contemporary epistemology has developed more nuanced approaches that attempt to preserve insights from traditional responses while avoiding their limitations. Reliabilist theories focus on whether beliefs are produced by reliable cognitive processes, rather than on whether they can be given adequate justification. According to reliabilism, beliefs constitute knowledge when they result from processes that generally produce true beliefs in the relevant circumstances. This approach attempts to sidestep the regress problem by grounding knowledge in objective features of our cognitive processes rather than in subjective justification. If perception, memory, and reasoning are in fact reliable belief-forming processes, then beliefs produced by these processes constitute knowledge regardless of whether we can provide ultimate justification for trusting them. Virtue epistemology focuses on the intellectual character of believers, rather than on the logical structure of justification or the reliability of cognitive processes. According to virtue epistemology, knowledge results from the exercise of intellectual virtues like curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual courage, and careful reasoning. Beliefs held by intellectually virtuous agents are more likely to constitute knowledge than beliefs held by intellectually vicious agents. This approach shifts attention from abstract questions about justification to practical questions about what kinds of intellectual character traits promote good thinking. Rather than seeking ultimate foundations for knowledge, virtue epistemologists focus on cultivating the personal qualities that make people better thinkers and inquirers. Contextualist approaches suggest that standards for knowledge and justification vary with the context of inquiry, rather than being fixed absolutely. What counts as adequate justification in everyday conversation might be different from what counts as adequate justification in scientific research or legal proceedings. This contextual variability dissolves the regress problem by denying that there must be universal standards for justification. The infinite regress of reasons has important implications for education, public discourse, and democratic decision-making. If ultimate justification is impossible, how should we approach the teaching of beliefs and values? How should citizens evaluate competing political claims when perfect justification is unavailable? These practical questions require developing approaches to reasoning and decision-making that acknowledge the limits of justification while preserving commitment to evidence and rational argument. Educational approaches that emphasize critical thinking and intellectual virtues might be more appropriate than approaches that focus on transmitting supposedly certain knowledge. Teaching students to question assumptions, evaluate evidence, and consider alternative perspectives might be more valuable than teaching them to accept particular beliefs as ultimately justified. Public discourse benefits from recognizing the limits of justification while maintaining commitment to evidence-based reasoning. Democratic decision-making requires citizens who can evaluate competing arguments without demanding impossible levels of certainty. Understanding the regress problem can promote intellectual humility while encouraging continued engagement with difficult questions. The regress problem also has implications for understanding disagreement and tolerance. If ultimate justification is impossible, then reasonable people can disagree about important questions without one party being obviously irrational. This recognition might promote greater tolerance for intellectual diversity, while maintaining standards for rational discourse. Scientific practice provides a model for productive reasoning despite the regress problem. Scientists continue to make progress in understanding natural phenomena, despite the fact that scientific theories cannot be given ultimate justification. Scientific methods emphasize testing theories against experience, subjecting them to criticism, and revising them when they prove inadequate. This ongoing process of inquiry achieves remarkable practical success without requiring ultimate theoretical foundations. The regress problem ultimately teaches us that human reasoning operates within fundamental limitations that cannot be completely overcome through philosophical analysis. This recognition need not lead to skepticism or irrationalism, but can inspire more sophisticated approaches to reasoning that acknowledge uncertainty while preserving commitment to evidence and rational argument. Perhaps the most important lesson of the infinite regress of reasons is that the quest for ultimate justification, while natural and understandable, might be less crucial than we initially suppose. Human beings have developed remarkable knowledge and technology, created great art and literature, and built complex societies without resolving the fundamental epistemological puzzles that philosophers debate. This practical success suggests that the regress problem, while intellectually fascinating, need not undermine confidence in human reasoning and inquiry. The regress invites us to approach knowledge claims with appropriate humility, while remaining committed to careful reasoning and evidence evaluation.